Colter, that's your cook or your whole supply wagon?
Keep talking, Scarecrow.
Put that thing down, big woman.
I'm aiming at your whiskey.
You damn crazy woman!
Next time, bring manners.
A dust storm. A hard man. A woman nobody dared look at twice. Bernadette Burke didn't come west to find a husband. She came to find herself. Follow for the Western romance you won't be able to put down. The dust storm hit Oakhaven at noon. It didn't creep in from the horizon the way most storms do. It arrived all at once, a brown wall rolling across the flatlands like something offended by the town's existence. Loose shingles rattled. A barrel tipped over in the street, and nobody ran after it. Horses tucked their heads low and stamped. The few people still outdoors pulled their kerchiefs up and squinted west, the way you do when you know arguing with the weather is a fool's errand. Jedidiah Colter stood at the far end of the depot platform with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat brim angled down against the grit. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. The station master had tried to make conversation twice. Jed hadn't answered either time, and eventually the man had given up and gone back inside. That was generally how it worked with Jed. People tried once or twice, and then they stopped trying. He was watching the rail line disappear into the brown haze and thinking, for probably the fourth time this week, that he should have just sent a telegram canceling the whole arrangement. He'd tried this 3 times before. 3 women, 3 disasters. The first one took one look at the compound and burst into tears before he'd even unhitched the horse. The second lasted 2 days, ate nothing, and left a polite note folded on the kitchen table that said she had prayed on the matter and received clear guidance. The third one lasted 3 days, which Jed supposed was progress. But she'd been so frightened of him by the second evening that she'd locked herself in the storeroom and refused to come out until he promised to drive her back to the depot personally. He had driven her back. He'd been civil about it, too. He always was, when people finally had the good sense to go. This fourth one had been arranged by a different agency, different territory, different price. And Jed had said yes again, because the ranch needed someone who could cook and keep accounts and manage the spring supply runs, while he dealt with Sterling's hired hands, making life ugly along the east fence line. It was a practical arrangement. That was all it was. He didn't need companionship. He didn't want it. He needed functional help, and he'd pay for it fairly. And if she lasted longer than 72 hours, that would already put her ahead of the field. The train came out of the dust like a dark ghost. The whistle sounded twice. The platform shuddered under his boots as the engine slowed, and steam blew sideways across the boards in long white sheets. Jed straightened up and watched the passenger car doors. Several people stepped off. A drummer with a sample case. An older couple moving carefully, holding each other's arms. 2 men in town coats who looked like lawyers or land speculators, which in this territory were often the same thing. A young woman in a lavender dress who was clearly traveling through and not meant for him, and then the steps at the far end groaned, not in the polite way. Wooden steps groan when someone steps onto them. They groaned the way old timber does when it's been asked to do something serious. The sound drew attention before anyone could help it, and a few of the men loitering near the saloon across the street turned their heads. Bernadette Burke stepped off the train. She was big. There was no other honest way to start. Big-shouldered, full-figured, built solid through the chest and hips. She wore homespun wool the color of charcoal, and it had clearly been cut and sewn for work rather than fashion. Her boots were heavy leather, laced to the knee. Her hair was pinned back without ceremony, brown and a little damp at the temples from the heat of the rail car. She had a burn scar on her left forearm, visible between her sleeve and her glove, pink, white, and old. Her face was broad and plain, and completely calm. She stepped onto the platform, assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, turned back to the rail car door, and began unloading her trunks, not asking for help, not looking around for a porter. She simply reached up into the car, gripped the handle of the first trunk iron-bound, heavy enough that Jed could tell from across the platform. By the way, the car shifted slightly as she moved it and hauled it to the edge. Then she stepped back, crouched, got her arms around it, and set it down on the platform boards with a solid, resonant thud. One of the loiterers near the saloon laughed. Lord Almighty, did somebody order livestock? Another one, hey, sweetheart, you sure you came to the right stop? The stockyard's another 3 miles. A third, bet she eats more than Jed's whole remuda. They thought it was funny. They were the kind of men who always thought things were funny when the target was standing too far away to reach them. Birdie went back for the second trunk. Same process, same economy of motion. She didn't look at them. She didn't look anywhere except at the work in front of her. Jed walked down the platform. He stopped about 10 feet away, looked at the 2 trunks, looked at the woman, and said what came into his head, which had always been his problem, Pete said, though he didn't see it as a problem. I don't recall ordering an ox to haul my wagon. Birdie straightened up. She was shorter than him, but not by much, and something about the way she carried herself made the difference feel smaller than it measured. She looked at him directly, not the way nervous people look at someone they're afraid of, and not the way angry people look at someone they want to fight. She just looked at him, steady and unhurried, the way a person looks when they have absolutely nothing to prove and have already decided they're not going to waste time proving it anyway. Then she reached down, gripped the handle of the nearest trunk, and lifted it 2 inches off the platform, and dropped it. The impact hit the boards like a small cannon shot. People flinched. A nearby horse startled and skittered sideways. Dust jumped up from the platform cracks. Birdie didn't even glance at the reaction. She kept her eyes on Jed. Ox or not, she said, I carry my own weight. Her voice was low and clear and unhurried, with the flat, practical accent of Pennsylvania working country. If you're only here to decorate the hitching post, step aside so I can load the wagon myself. A moment went past. Jed looked at her. She looked back. Somewhere across the street, one of the loiterers made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh he was trying to swallow. Jed picked up the second trunk. He didn't say anything. He just picked it up and started walking toward where he'd tied the wagon, because the trunk needed to go there, and standing around making conversation about it wasn't going to change that fact. After a moment, he heard her pick up the first one and follow him. She kept up without effort. He put the trunk in the wagon bed and turned around to find her already there, with the other one, positioning it without being told, tucking it against the sideboard so it wouldn't shift on the road. She tested it once, with her knee, solid. She stepped back and looked at the setup, and apparently decided it was adequate. The station master hurried over with a mail packet and a manifest slip. Miss Burke, I need a signature on the freight manifest, and there are 2 additional crates in the cargo hold marked for Black Mesa. Birdie took the pen and signed without reading him the manifest line by line, which told Jed she'd read it before she'd left wherever she'd come from. The crates are supplies, she said. Flour, dried fruit, 2 replacement cook irons, and a box of ledger books. Can you hold them in the freight office until I can arrange pickup? Or will there be a storage charge? No charge for 48 hours, ma'am. Appreciated. She handed the pen back. Jed had his boot on the wagon step, ready to climb up, and he paused. Ledger books. He hadn't mentioned the accounts. He'd mentioned cooking and ranch upkeep in the correspondence. He hadn't said anything about the books. He didn't ask about it. He climbed up, took the reins, and waited. Birdie walked around to the other side of the wagon, stepped up, and settled onto the bench with the particular economy of someone who has been climbing onto benches their whole life and doesn't think of it as an event. She set her bag between her feet. She looked straight ahead at the road. The dust was still moving through town, grit ticking against the wagon boards. The saloon men across the street had mostly lost interest. One of them was still watching, but he looked uncertain. Now, the way people do when something hasn't gone the way they expected. Jed clicked his tongue, and the horses started moving. They were out of town and onto the ranch road before either of them spoke again. The road here was flat and open, running through scrubland toward the mesa in the middle distance. The light was the particular hard brass color it gets into New Mexico at high noon when the sun is directly overhead and doesn't offer shade to anyone. You brought ledger books, Jed said. I did. I didn't request them. You didn't have to. She was watching the landscape as she talked, and something in her attention seemed genuine, like she was actually looking at it rather than pretending to. I read the arrangement letter twice. You're running a working ranch with stock and supply contracts, and you mentioned the accounts were behind. Behind means someone hasn't been keeping them, or someone has been keeping them wrong. Either way, you need ledger books, and they're cheaper in Pennsylvania than they'll be at whatever the Oak Haven mercantile charges. Jed didn't answer right away. You bring cook irons from Pennsylvania too? The ones the agency mentioned were cast iron, and they'd listed a replacement as a current need. It's cheaper to ship from the foundries back east than to order through a territorial supplier. Freight rate difference is considerable if you know which lines to use. She paused. I also brought sourdough starter. The active culture, not dried, it survives rail travel if you keep it warm, which I did. Where did you keep it warm? My coat pocket for the last 6 hours. It's been a long trip. Jed looked at the road. You always this practical, he said. Generally. Women I've dealt with usually want to talk about curtains. I'll look at your curtains once I've assessed the kitchen and the pantry situation, she said. If curtains become relevant, I'll mention it. Something shifted in the way the silence sat between them. Not warmer exactly, but different, less taut. The road curved around a dry wash, and the mesa came into clearer view, red-brown and massive against the bright sky. At its base, barely visible yet, the low adobe shapes of the ranch compound. Place looks quiet from here, Birdie said. It's not. The letter mentioned water rights trouble. Jed's jaw tightened slightly. The letter mentioned more than I meant to put in a letter. The agency writes the letters. I expect you didn't review it closely before it went out. She said this without any particular point to it, no edge, just a statement of what had probably happened. There's a man named Sterling, I gathered, and something about hired men causing problems along a fence line, gathered from the letter, and from asking some questions before I left. It's a small enough territory that people in Denver know the name Sterling. Jed turned his head and looked at her for the first time since they'd left town. Not quickly, not with any particular expression. He looked, the way he looked at things he was trying to figure out. She was watching the mesa. Her profile was broad and plain and completely settled. The burn scar caught the light. You asked about it before you came, he said. I asked about it before I bought the ticket, she said. I'm not in the habit of walking into situations I haven't thought about. Most women in your position would consider the domestic situation, the house, the work expected. I considered those too. She turned and looked at him briefly, then back at the road. A house without walls is just ground. I wanted to know what kind of trouble the walls were in before I committed to the address. He looked forward again. The horses pulled them on. The mesa rose larger in front of them, solid and indifferent, the way all the old stone out here is indifferent. It had been here before any of them. It would be here long after. 3 women left before you, Jed said. Flat, factual. He wasn't apologizing for it. I know. The agency mentioned 2. There were 3. Then the agency undercounted. She didn't sound concerned. Were they afraid of you or afraid of the situation? The question was asked like she was sorting inventory. Not personal, not accusing, just clarifying. Jed thought about it honestly, which wasn't something he usually did when the subject came up. First one was afraid of the place. Second was afraid of everything. Third was mostly afraid of me. And you gave them reason to be afraid of you? I didn't hurt them. That wasn't what I asked, another pause. I was not, Jed said carefully, at any point welcoming. Because you wanted them to leave, he didn't answer. Which was an answer. Birdie nodded. slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already figured. The agency told me you weren't what they'd call a warm personality. They used the word difficult. One woman used the word hostile. She looked at the horizon. I've worked coal camp mess halls for 11 years. Hostile is a Tuesday. Something crossed Jed's face. It was quick and not entirely readable, but it was there. The scar, he said. The one on your arm. Industrial hearth. 8 years ago, I moved too fast in their kitchen and caught the edge of the door. She said it plainly. No drama in it. Old stories told enough times eventually become just facts. Didn't keep you out of the kitchen. No, she agreed. It didn't. The road dipped slightly as it approached the compound. The adobe walls came into better focus, and Jed watched her face as she took it in. He always watched for the reaction. Dirty, tired walls. A gate that needed rehinging. The whole compound sun-bleached and battered, carrying the particular look of a place that has been neglected, not from laziness, but from one man having more problems than time. Birdie looked at it without flinching. She didn't look enthusiastic either. She just looked at it the way she'd looked at the mesa, taking it in as a real thing rather than a problem or a disappointment. The kitchen is inside the main building, she asked. Left side. And the smoke situation you mentioned in passing in the letter, is that the main flue or a secondary one? He'd mentioned it in passing because it was a passing thing. A nuisance. A detail. Main flue. It backs up when the wind comes from the northwest, which it does most afternoons. I've dealt with backed flues. We had 4 of them at the camp kitchen, and they all needed different solutions. She was already looking at the roofline, assessing the chimney angle. I'll want to look at it before I start dinner, if that's agreeable. It's your kitchen, he said. Then he stopped, because that came out differently than he'd intended, and he wasn't entirely sure what he'd intended. She glanced at him briefly. She might have smiled very slightly. It was hard to tell. Then I'll start with the flue, she said. They pulled through the gate and into the yard. The horses were used to the place and moved into position near the water trough without being directed. A ranch hand named Duro came out from the barn, stopped when he saw Birdie, and did the thing people always do, the quick visual assessment, the pause. Birdie climbed down from the wagon before Jed had even set the brake. She stood in the yard, looked around once, looked up at the smoke-stained chimney top, looked at the gate that needed rehinging, looked at the broken step on the left side of the porch. Then she reached back up into the wagon bed and picked up her bag. Mr. Colter, she said. Jed stepped down. Jed. She said it once, like she was filing it. If you'll show me where things are stored, I'll start on the flue and have dinner ready before dark. Jed looked at her, standing in his yard, broad and plain and solid as the mesa behind her, with a sourdough starter in her coat pocket and ledger books in a crate at the freight office, and she looked like she'd already decided the place was workable and moved on to the next question. He'd expected nervousness. He'd expected the reaction to the compound, the slow realization of what the life out here actually looked like up close. Every one of them before had taken one look and started calculating how to leave. She was calculating how to fix the flue. Storage is in the back, he said. I'll show you. He walked toward the house. She followed, her boot, heels steady on the packed dirt. Behind them, Duro was still standing by the barn, watching, wearing the expression of a man who had seen 3 women leave this place in quick succession and was not sure what he was looking at now. The dust storm had mostly passed, dropping to a low grumble of wind along the ground. The sky above the mesa was going that deep, hard blue. It goes in the afternoon, cloudless and enormous and indifferent to everything below it. Jed pushed the front door open and stepped back to let her through. Birdie walked in without hesitating. He heard her stop in the main room, heard the quiet as she looked around. Then he heard her move toward the kitchen side, heard a drawer open, heard her test the weight of the iron door on the stove. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Through the window, caught the afternoon light and went a deep, warm red, the same color it had been every afternoon for 1,000 years. unmoved by whatever happened at its feet. He went inside and closed the door behind him. The flu was worse than Jed had let on. Birdie figured that out inside of 10 minutes. She'd opened the iron stove door, looked up into the shaft with a candle, and seen the problem clearly enough. Years of grease buildup along the interior walls, a cracked clay liner about 4 feet up, and a baffle plate that had rusted halfway off its hinge and was sitting at an angle that directed half the smoke straight back into the room instead of up and out. It wasn't just a backed flue. It was a backed flue waiting to become a chimney fire. She stood there with the candle tilted and thought about it. Then she went looking for tools. The storage room Jed had shown her was organized the way things get organized when one person is managing too much alone, functional, in the sense that nothing was lost, but crowded and without any obvious system. She found a long-handled brush, a short pry bar, a tin of linseed oil, a bundle of rags that had been used for something else first, and a coil of wire. She brought all of it back to the kitchen, added a bucket of water from the yard pump, tied her hair back tighter, and got to work. The grease came off in long, dark strips. It was old and thick and smelled like every bad meal that had ever been cooked in that room, and it took the better part of an hour just to clear the first 2 feet of shaft. Her arms were black to the elbow by the time she got to the cracked liner. She examined the crack, decided it was stable enough to hold for now, but would need to be sealed before winter, made a mental note of it, and moved up to the baffle plate. The baffle plate was the real project. The hinge pin had corroded through, and the plate was hanging on one side only, vibrating in the updraft and doing nothing useful. She worked the pry bar in carefully, got the plate loose, dropped it into the bucket with a clang that echoed through the whole kitchen, and spent a few minutes improvising a new support with the wire until she could source a proper replacement hinge. She tested the draft with a scrap of paper held near the opening. The paper moved upward, steadily. Better. She cleaned up what she could, reset the stove, and started a small fire to check the draw. The smoke went up clean. The room stayed clear. She stood back and watched it for a full minute, because a minute is long enough to be sure. Satisfied, she banked the fire low and went to deal with the kitchen itself. It was a hard room to look at, honestly. Not dirty, in the way of a room that had been neglected out of laziness, more like a room that had been used hard and not tended, which is a different thing. The surfaces were thick, with grease smoke staining the walls, gray-brown near the ceiling. The floor had grit ground into it. The shelves held mismatched tins and jars, some labeled, some not, and the flour bin had developed a thin crust around the rim that meant it had gotten damp at some point and dried that way. The iron pots were in reasonable condition, which told her someone had known how to care for them once. She started clearing the shelves. Everything came down. She organized the tins on the floor, in groups what was still good, what needed checking, what needed to go. 3 jars of something unlabeled that had sealed wrong. A tin of cornmeal with weevils working through the top inch, a sack of dried beans that looked fine and weighed nearly 8 pounds, which was something to work with. She washed the shelves down with a rag and water, then wiped them again with a small amount of the linseed oil on a dry cloth, which sealed the wood against moisture and kept future grime from setting in as deep. The coal camp kitchen boss who'd taught her that was a bad-tempered Hungarian named Eva, who communicated mostly in gestures and disapproving sounds. But she'd known things about a kitchen that Birdie still used every day. Jed came through once, just appeared in the doorway, looked at the tins arranged on the floor, looked at Birdie on her knees, wiping down the lowest shelf, said nothing, and left. She heard him go out the front. She kept working. By late afternoon, the kitchen was clean. Not finished, the floor still needed proper scrubbing, and the walls would take a full day with the right solution, but clean, in the sense that she could now work in it without fighting the room. She built the fire back up properly, set the sourdough starter out to warm near the stove, and started on bread. Sourdough from an active culture is not fast, but it doesn't require much either. You feed it, you wait, you shape, you wait again. She had time. She let the starter wake up properly from the rail journey, while she made a simple pork and bean stew from the canned pork in a tin that had sealed correctly, and the 8 pounds of dried beans she'd soaked in a pot of water during the flu work. The beans wouldn't be fully soft yet, but soft enough, and the pork fat would carry the flavor. The bread took the shape she wanted. She put it in the oven to bake, checked the stew, and went to find the ranch accounts. She'd seen a box of papers on the shelf in the main room and suspected that was them. It was. She carried the box to the kitchen table where the light was better and sat down and started going through it. The accounts were in reasonable order up to about 3 years ago. Whoever had kept them then had a clear hand and a logical system: income on one side, expenditures on the other. The columns tallying cleanly. Then something had changed. The records got sparse, then irregular, then almost absent. For the last year and a half, there was almost nothing. A few receipts stuffed loose in the box, a scattering of notes on torn paper. Nothing organized. Birdie laid it all out on the table and started reading. The receipts told a story even without complete records. A pattern emerged in the supply costs that she recognized from the coal camps: prices inflating far beyond regional average, quantities falling short of what was billed. A sack of flour billed at 40 pounds, but recorded elsewhere as 38. Nail stock priced at territory merchant rates, when the same stock could be sourced from a regional wholesaler for 60 cents less per pound. It added up in small amounts, but it added up consistently, which meant it wasn't accidental. She kept reading. The bread smell was filling the room now, warm and yeasty and substantial. She heard the front door, and then boots in the hall. Jed appeared in the kitchen doorway a second time. This time he stopped and stayed there. He looked different from when they'd ridden in. Dirtier. He'd been working outside, and the dust had gotten into the creases of his face and the back of his neck. He was looking at the table, at the papers spread across it, organized into sections, then at the bread cooling on the rack, then at Birdie, who had not looked up from the receipt in her hand. "Stew's ready when you want it," she said. "The bread needs another 20 minutes to cool, or it'll be gummy inside." He came into the room slowly. Not suspicious, exactly. More like a man approaching something unfamiliar and preferring to move at his own pace. He stood at the corner of the table and looked at the papers. "Those are my accounts," he said. "They are. I found them on the shelf. I didn't say you could go through them." Birdie put down the receipt she was holding and looked up at him. "You said the accounts were behind. I brought ledger books for a reason. Going through the existing records is the first step before I can set up anything new." She held his gaze. "If you want me to put them back, I'll put them back." Jed looked at the papers. He looked at the way she'd organized them, the problem receipts in one section, the old clean records in another, the loose notes separated out. "What did you find?" he said. She gestured at the section with the receipts. "Your town merchants have been billing you short on quantities and long on prices, consistently, for at least 2 years. It's not a large amount on any single purchase. It's small enough that a man running a ranch alone wouldn't necessarily catch it without sitting down with all of it at once. But added together across 2 years, the overcharge is substantial." She pointed to a number she'd written on a scrap of paper at the edge of the table. "That's my rough estimate. I'd have to go through everything carefully to confirm it." Jed looked at the number. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "That's from the Oak Haven General Store," he said. "Primarily. There's a smaller amount from the feed supplier, and one receipt from a man named Holt that doesn't match anything else in the records. I couldn't identify what it was for." Holt is a fixed fence contractor. He came out twice last summer. Jed pulled the chair across from her out from the table and sat down. He looked at the papers. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The records were kept cleanly before. 3 years ago," Birdie said. Her voice was careful. Not gentle exactly, but not blunt either. Somewhere in between. They stopped around the same time. The prices went irregular. Jed was quiet. He reached out and turned one of the older receipts toward him, looked at the handwriting. "My wife kept the accounts," he said. "Before?" He said it plainly, the way people say things they've said enough times that the rawness has worn down to a flat surface. But the flat surface was still there. Birdie didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything for a moment. She picked up another receipt and looked at it. The system she used was good, straightforward, and clear. "I can build from it." Jed put the old receipt down. "The ledger books you brought," he said. "They're still at the freight office. I'll collect them tomorrow and get the new record started." She set down the paper in her hand and reached across the table for the scrap, with her estimate on it, turned it toward him. "This is a recoverable amount, if you want to pursue it. You'd need documentation, and you'd need someone willing to challenge Oakhaven merchants, which, I understand, may not be a simple thing in this territory." "Oakhaven merchants know Sterling," Jed said. "Flat. I suspected something like that." She pulled the scrap back. "Then documentation is still worth keeping. For when the situation changes." He looked at her across the table. She was black to the elbows still, despite washing up. There was a smear of chimney grease near her jaw she hadn't gotten. She was looking at the accounts with the same attention she'd given the chimney and the shelves, like they were all the same category of problem, which Jed supposed they were. "Duro," said the flu. "Draws clean now," Jed said. "It does. The baffle plate hinge is gone. I've wired it temporarily, but it needs a proper replacement before the cold comes. The liner has a crack about 4 feet up. It's stable, but it needs sealing. Otherwise, you risk hot gas leaking into the wall cavity. I'll need clay and a specific type of sand for the mortar mix, which I can tell you the composition of if you want to order it." Jed watched her go through this list. She delivered it the way she'd delivered everything else, without performance, without looking for a reaction. Just information that needed to be communicated because it was relevant. "You know chimney work," he said. "I know industrial kitchen work. The principles are the same scaled down. Where'd you learn it?" "Coal camp mess halls in Pennsylvania. 12 years, 4 different camps. The last one I ran myself." She glanced at him briefly. "When the equipment breaks, you either learn to fix it or you stop feeding 140 men, and they get unpleasant about it quickly." Jed's mouth moved slightly. "Not quite a smile. I imagine they do," he said. She got up and checked the bread, pressed it lightly on top, listened for the hollow sound. She took it off the rack and set it on the board, and she took the stew off the back of the stove and ladled it into bowls. 2 bowls. She put them on the table with the bread and sat back down. Jed looked at the meal in front of him. He looked at it long enough that it would have been awkward if Birdie had been paying attention to it. But she was looking at a receipt again. He ate. The bread was good, dense and sour, and properly cooked all the way through. The stew was heavy with pork fat, and the beans had taken on the flavor of everything around them. It was not fancy food. It was the kind of food that a cold body and a long day require, without knowing that's what they require until the first bite. He ate without speaking. So did she, between examining papers. After a while, he said, without particular lead-up, "The chores tomorrow." She looked up. "There's a tallow vat that needs rendering. It's been waiting 2 weeks because I haven't had time. It's outside South Yard. In the afternoon, it gets the full sun and the smell carries badly," he said it, looking at his bowl. "It's a full afternoon of work. Hot. Unpleasant." Birdie understood what he was doing. She didn't say so. "What else?" she said. He looked up. "What else needs doing? Give me the full list, and I'll work out the order." Jed put down his spoon. He looked at her across the table, and she could see him recalibrating, the way people do when something hasn't gone the way they set it up to go. He'd expected something from the mention of the tallow vat. A flinch, maybe. A question about whether there was something else she could do. Instead, she'd asked for the full list. "Tallow vat needs rendering," he repeated. The smoke flew in the storage shed. Needs checking different issue from the kitchen. The cap might be blocked by a bird nest. There are 3 sections of fence in the north pasture that need new wire and the posts tamped down. Supply run to town eventually, but not until Duro comes back from the east fence check. And the kitchen floor needs proper scrubbing. Birdie nodded. The storage shed flue I can check in the morning. Tallow vat. In the afternoon, you're right, that it needs full heat for rendering. The floor I can do in sections. It doesn't have to be all at once. The fence is yours, or Duro's. I'm not a fence hand, and I don't know the pasture layout yet. She paused. Supply run. I'll make a list as I go through the pantry properly. There are things missing that I'll need to do the cooking right. And given what I found in those accounts, I'd like to come along and manage the purchasing directly. Jed was quiet. You don't trust the suppliers, he said. I trust a ledger, she said. People behave differently when someone is writing down the quantity as they count it out. He looked at her for a moment. The tallow vat, he said. It's not a small job. I've rendered tallow before. It's not complicated, just unpleasant and time-consuming. She turned a receipt over and made a note on the blank side. I'll need wood for the fire under the vat, and something to strain the finished product through burlap or cheesecloth. Do we have either? Storage room. There's burlap, then it's manageable. Jed picked up his spoon again. He looked at his bowl. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the bread smell was still in the air, layered over the clean smell of the linseed oil on the shelves. The merchants in Oakhaven, he said. If you're at the counter writing things down, they'll know you're watching. Yes, she agreed. Sterling's people watch who watches, I expect so. She looked up. Would you rather I didn't? Jed thought about it honestly for the second time that day. No, he said finally, do it. She nodded and went back to the receipt in her hand. Outside, the wind had come back to a low movement across the yard, and the fire in the stove settled and breathed in that regular, reliable way a good fire does when the flue is drawing properly. The lamp on the table pushed the shadows back to the edges of the room. Jed finished his meal. He sat for a moment after, the way he didn't usually sit, without immediate purpose, without the next task already pulling him up. He was looking at the accounts spread across the table, and thinking something he didn't put into words. Birdie made a final note on her scrap of paper, added it to the stack of problem receipts, and put a flat stone from the windowsill on top to hold them. I'll need those ledger books first thing tomorrow, she said. Freight office opens at 7. I'll be ready at 6:30. Jed stood up and took his bowl to the wash basin. He rinsed it, set it on the shelf. He paused at the kitchen door. The accounts were organized on the table. The breadboard held the remains of the loaf, nearly half of it gone between them. The flue drew clean. The shelves were bare wood and linseed, oil, and order. He looked at it. Then he walked down the hall without saying anything, and Birdie heard his bootsteps on the floor overhead as he went upstairs. She sat for a while longer at the table, going over the numbers. Outside the mesa was dark against the stars, immovable and patient, and the ranch settled around it, quietly, the way things settle when they have been genuinely tended rather than just endured. They came in the middle of the afternoon, when the heat was at its worst, and the yard was quiet. Birdie heard them before she saw them. She was in the south yard, dealing with the tallow vat, which was exactly as unpleasant as advertised, a cast-iron vessel the size of a washtub, filled with raw beef fat that had to be rendered down slowly over a wood fire until the pure tallow separated from the tissue and could be strained off clean. The smell was something between a slaughterhouse and a candle factory, heavy and animal and inescapable. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back under a kerchief, and she was stirring the vat with a long wooden paddle, watching the surface for the clear shimmer that meant the fat was rendering correctly and not scorching. She heard hooves first, multiple horses, not in any hurry, the particular rhythm of riders who want to be heard coming. She kept stirring. Jed came out of the barn at the sound. He'd been working on a saddle fitting, and he still had the leather punch in his hand. He stopped in the yard and watched the gate. 4 riders came through. The one in front was broad across the shoulders, sitting his horse with the deliberate ease of a man who had spent a long time practicing looking relaxed while being threatening. He had a face that had seen sun and violence in roughly equal measure, and pale eyes that moved across the yard and took inventory without appearing to. His name was Bram Vogel, and Birdie had heard it mentioned twice in her 6 days at the ranch, once by Jed, once by Duro, and both times in the same tone people use when they'd rather not mention it at all. The 3 men behind Vogel spread slightly as they entered the yard. Not dramatically, just enough to make the geometry of the situation clear. Vogel stopped his horse 10 feet from Jed and looked down at him. Colter. He said the name like it tasted like something he'd rather spit out. Sterling wants an answer on the water deed. You've had 3 weeks. I gave Sterling an answer 3 weeks ago, Jed said. He hadn't moved. Leather punch still in his hand. He didn't hear it the way you meant it. Then his ears need work. Vogel's pale eyes moved across the yard and found Birdie in the south corner with the tallow vat. He looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that is meant to be felt at a distance. Then he looked back at Jed with a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. You finally find someone willing to cook for you, he said. Must have had to go a long way to find a woman big enough not to be scared of the place. One of the men behind him laughed. Vogel raised his voice just enough to carry across the yard. What's the matter, sweetheart? They run out of food where you came from? Another one. Looks like she ate twice on the way out. The third man made a sound that wasn't a word. Jed's jaw set hard. His hand tightened on the leather punch, and he took a step forward, and Birdie could see the calculation happening in him. Could see him doing the math on 4 armed men against 1, on what starting a fight in his own yard in the open would cost, and on the particular kind of anger that makes men stop doing math altogether. She set the paddle across the top of the vat. She walked to the porch. She went through the front door, moved to the corner of the main room, where the shotgun lived on 2 iron brackets, and lifted it down. It was a double-barrel 12-gauge, and she'd found it on her 2nd day at the ranch and cleaned it the same afternoon because it had needed cleaning. She checked both chambers now out of habit, not because she doubted herself, but because checking is correct procedure, and correct procedure matters more when things are tense. Both chambers loaded. She walked back out onto the porch. The conversation in the yard had continued in her absence. Jed's voice was low and controlled, which Birdie had learned meant he was closer to the edge, not farther from it. Vogel was smiling the smile of someone who is enjoying the pressure he's creating. Birdie stepped to the edge of the porch and raised the shotgun. She wasn't pointing it at anyone. She was pointing it at the whiskey jug, hanging from a leather cord, off Vogel's saddle horn, the one men like Vogel carry like a decoration or a habit. It was swinging slightly with the horse's movement. She'd been stirring a tallow vat all afternoon, and her arms were entirely steady. Territorial homestead defense codes, she said, loud enough to carry. Clear enough that there was no pretending she hadn't said it. A homesteader has the legal right to defend a registered property against trespassers who demonstrate threatening conduct. 4 armed men entering private property without invitation constitutes grounds. She paused. I'd like you to leave, Mr. Vogel. I'm going to give you a count of 3 to start moving. Vogel looked at her. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. You're pointing a gun at me, woman. I'm pointing a gun at your whiskey jug, she said. I haven't decided which direction to point it next. 1. One of the men behind Vogel moved his hand toward his hip. 2, Birdie said. Easy, Vogel said without taking his eyes off her. He said it to his man, not to her. 3. She shot the jug. The report was enormous in the open yard. The jug exploded, and whiskey and pottery shards spattered across Vogel's saddle and coat and the neck of his horse. The horse shied hard, and Vogel had to grip with his knees to stay seated, and the 3 men behind him pulled their horses back and sideways from the sound and the motion. The echo rolled out across the flatlands and came back, once faint. Birdie lowered the shotgun to the crook of her arm. The second barrel was still loaded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Vogel got his horse settled. He looked at the shards of jug hanging from the cord at his saddle. He looked at his coat, wet with whiskey. He looked at Birdie. His face had changed. The ease was gone out of it. What was underneath was something colder and less comfortable to look at, and Birdie looked at it directly and waited. "Smart woman," Vogel said. His voice was very quiet. "Smarter women than you have made mistakes out here. Smarter men than you have miscounted," she said. He looked at Jed. 3 weeks becomes 2 weeks, Colter. Sterling's patience has a floor. Jed said nothing. Vogel turned his horse and rode out. The 3 men followed. Nobody said anything else. The gate was still open from when they'd ridden in, and they went through it and back onto the road and kept moving until the sound of the hooves diminished into the flatland quiet. Jed stood in the yard. He stood there for a moment after they were gone, and Birdie could see the tension still in his shoulders, the particular rigidity of a man who has been holding himself back and hasn't quite let go of the effort yet. She went back inside, replaced the shotgun on its brackets, and went back to the tallow vat. The fire under it had burned down a bit while she was gone. She added 2 pieces of wood and picked up the paddle and started stirring again. The tallow was close to ready. The tissue was separating from the clear fat, rising in pale threads. Jed came around the corner of the building about 4 minutes later. He stood at the edge of the south yard and watched her stir the vat. "You know territorial homestead defense codes," he said. "I looked into the relevant laws before I bought the ticket," she said. "I told you I don't walk into situations I haven't thought about. You could have gotten shot. So could you, if you'd swung that leather punch at one of them?" She stirred the vat slowly, watching the surface. 4 armed men. Starting a physical confrontation in the open yard would have gone badly. Introducing a legal argument with a loaded firearm tends to change the cost-benefit calculation. Jed was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" "Pennsylvania." The camp superintendent who ran the second camp I worked was a decent man, and he believed women who worked in isolated locations should know how to protect themselves. He taught anyone who wanted to learn. She lifted the paddle and looked at the tallow dripping from it, clear, golden, nearly done. He was right. Jed came closer and looked at the vat. "You hit a moving target at that distance. It wasn't moving much." She set the paddle back in, "And I've been looking at it all afternoon. You get to know a target after a few hours." He almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. "Vogel won't forget it," he said, and the almost law was gone. "I know, Sterling will hear." "Yes." She kept stirring. He stood there. The fire popped under the vat, and a thin column of steam rose and went sideways in the light afternoon wind. "Thank you," Jed said. He said it quietly, the way people say things they're not used to saying. Birdie looked up briefly. "Go check the saddle fitting," she said. "I'll call when the tallow's strained." He went back to the barn. The tallow was ready in another 30 minutes. She strained it through the burlap into the waiting tins, working carefully, tipping the heavy vat with a pair of iron handles and pouring steadily. The clear tallow ran through the burlap, and the tissue stayed behind. She sealed the tins while the tallow was still warm enough to settle flat, then cleaned up the vat and banked the fire out. Her arms were tired. Her back was tired. The smell was in her hair and her clothes, and she was going to need a thorough wash before dinner. She went inside and started water heating. While the water heated, she assembled what she needed for dinner and thought about Vogel. Not about the confrontation itself that was done. She thought about what came next, which was the more useful thing to think about. Vogel had backed down today because she'd introduced a legal framework that made violence in front of witnesses costly. That would hold until Sterling decided the cost didn't matter anymore, which meant it would hold for a while, but not forever. She was drying her hands and thinking about this when she heard Jed in the back of the house, and then a sharp intake of breath that wasn't the sound of a man who'd stubbed his toe. It was the sound of a man absorbing significant pain and trying not to. She found him in the small room off the back hall, sitting on the edge of a low cot, his shirt pulled away from his right side. He had a wound there that shouldn't have been the way. It was an old scar from what looked like shrapnel along his lower rib cage, and it had opened at the edges and was angry and red and clearly infected. "How long has it been like this?" she said. Jed looked up. He looked at her the way men look at someone who has caught them at something they'd rather handle privately. It reopens sometimes. "That's not an answer." She came into the room. "May I look?" He didn't say yes exactly, but he didn't pull away, and she took that as consent. She leaned in and looked at the wound without touching it first. The infection was real hot-looking, with a pale center that meant it had been building for at least a few days. The surrounding tissue was swollen. "This needs to be cleaned and dressed," she said. "Properly. It's infected. It'll close up. Not before it gets worse." She straightened. "I have carbolic solution in my kit. It'll sting significantly. Do you want something to bite, or will you manage?" He looked at her for a moment. "I'll manage," he said. She went and got her kit. It was a proper medical kit, the kind that develops over years of working in isolated locations where the nearest doctor is always farther away than you'd like. Carbolic acid solution, clean linen strips, a roll of bandage cloth, a needle and catgut for suturing if needed, a tin of drawing salve, and a small bottle of laudanum she kept for genuine emergencies and almost never opened. She came back and set it on the cot beside him. He'd moved, so his back was against the wall, giving her room to work. She pulled the small stool from the corner and sat facing him, close enough to work properly. She opened the carbolic solution. "This is going to hurt," she said. "You said that. I wanted to make sure you heard it." She applied the solution to a clean linen pad and pressed it carefully to the wound. Jed's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck went tight. He breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate, and he made no sound. She worked steadily. The carbolic cleaned out the infected tissue, which was the necessary part and also the painful part, and she didn't rush it, but she didn't drag it out either. She'd done this in coal camp infirmaries, when the mine doctor was underground or unavailable, which was more often than it should have been. "The shrapnel wound," she said, to give him something to track, besides the pain. "This is old. 12 years, he said it through his teeth. "Battle skirmish," he breathed. "South Texas. There were 4 of us and significantly more of them, and we made a number of poor decisions." "Did you win?" "We survived," he said, which we counted as winning at the time. She applied fresh solution and he absorbed it. "A fragment still in there?" she asked. "Mostly out. There's a piece the size of a thumbnail that the surgeon couldn't reach without causing more damage than leaving it caused." He breathed again. "It moves sometimes, when I'm in cold weather or I take a hard fall. Sometimes it works its way close to the surface and then it reopens." "And you ignore it," she said. "I manage it. You managed it into an infection." She set the soiled pad aside and looked at the wound. "Cleaner now." Still angry, but the pale center was gone, which was good. She opened the drawing salve. "This will pull the remaining infection out over the next 2 days. I'll redress it tomorrow morning. You'll need to keep it covered and dry." She applied the salve and began bandaging, working the linen strips around his rib cage with the particular technique that holds properly without constricting the breath. She'd learned it from the same camp doctor who'd been unavailable too often. Jed was quiet while she worked. The immediate pain was past, and he was coming back down from it, his breathing evening out. The room was small, and the lamp was close, and she was working near enough to him that she was aware of the details, that distance doesn't show the other scars, older and fully healed, scattered across his side and his forearm. A life written in the body's record. "Vogel called you a half-breed today," she said quietly. She wasn't looking for a reaction. She was tucking the end of the bandage under, and she said it because it needed to be said. "He said worse than that." "Yes," Jed said. "Does he say it every time?" Most times. She tied off the bandage. She sat back and looked at her work. The men at the coal camps used to say things about my size. Every day, some version. You're too big, too much too heavy, too obvious. You take up too much room, eat too much, breathe too much. She began putting her kit back together. It took me a long time to understand that those comments are never really about the person they're aimed at. They're about the person saying them. Vogel calls you names because something about you frightens him, and naming it is the only power he thinks he has looking at her. Jed was looking at her. She could feel it, though she was looking at the kit. Your scars mean you survived lead, she said. My size means I survived starvation and backbreaking labor. Neither of us owes this valley an apology for the space we occupy. The room was quiet. Outside, the late afternoon wind moved through the yard, and the horses shifted in the barn. Jed said nothing. For a moment, then that superintendent. The one who taught you to shoot. Hendricks, she said. Bill Hendricks. Good man to have known, he was. She closed her kit and stood. Don't get that bandage wet. If it soaks through before morning, call me, and I'll redress it tonight. She picked up the soiled linen and moved to the doorway, Birdie. She stopped. He hadn't used her name before. He'd used it now without appearing to notice that he had, which probably meant it was genuine. She looked back. Jed was sitting against the wall with his shirt still loose, looking at her with an expression that she couldn't entirely name. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though that might have been part of it. It was something more like the look of a man who has been alone for long enough that he's forgotten what it feels like to have someone simply handle a thing that needs handling and not ask for anything in return. The stew, he said, from the other night. The bread. She waited. I haven't eaten like that in a while, he said. It was not, she understood, a comment about the food. Dinner in an hour, she said, and went back down the hall. She cooked with the window open and the evening air coming in, cool off the mesa, and the lamplight in the kitchen was warm, and the smell of what she was making was good. And Duro knocked before he came in and ate at the table, without being asked, which she took as a reasonable sign that things were settling. Jed came to the table without being called, which she took as another. He ate with his left arm, closer to his side than usual, favoring the bandaged ribs unconsciously. She didn't mention it. She passed the bread without comment. He took it without comment. They ate. Outside, the stars came out over the mesa one at a time, and then all at once, and the flatlands went dark and silent and enormous, and the ranch sat at the foot of the stone in the lamplight of its own kitchen, held together by tallow and carbolic and sourdough and the careful, deliberate attention of two people who had both learned, in different ways and from different suffering, that the things worth holding require tending. Birdie cleared the table. Jed sat for a moment, then stood and took his plate to the wash basin without being asked. He set it down. He looked out the dark window. Then he went down the hall and upstairs, and his boots on the floor above her head were slower than usual, careful over the ribs. Birdie washed up. She checked the shotgun on the brackets before she went to bed. Both barrels. Clean. She went to sleep with the second barrel, still loaded, because Vogel had not seemed like a man who made only one visit, and because correct procedure matters most when things are tense. The sky went wrong before dawn. Birdie noticed it when she got up to start the stove, a pressure in the air, the particular heaviness that settles in before weather arrives and means business. The stars were gone behind something thick and colorless, and the temperature had dropped enough overnight that the water in the kitchen basin had a skim of ice at the edges. Not deep cold. Not yet. But the kind of cold that is explaining what's coming next. She stoked the stove and looked out the window toward the mesa. The mesa had disappeared. That was when she knew it was serious. She got dressed in everything she had. 2 wool undershirts, her heavy work trousers, the canvas coat she'd brought from Pennsylvania, that had seen her through 4 winters at altitude coal camps, and was still sound. She was pulling her second boot on, when she heard Jed already downstairs, heard the front door open and close. She went out after him. He was in the yard, looking north, where the wall of cloud was coming down off the high country in a slow gray avalanche. His breath showed white. He had his hat down and his coat collar up, and he was looking at the sky, the way men look at it when they've lived under it long enough to read it. "The herd," he said without turning around. "Where are they?" "High Box Canyon. I moved them up last week for the late grass. If this comes in the way it looks." He stopped, she understood. A herd trapped in a high box canyon in a serious snowstorm doesn't necessarily die from cold. It dies from panic, from crushing, from being unable to find shelter and running itself to exhaustion against stone walls. The canyon would hold the snow and keep adding to it, and the cattle would have nowhere to go. "How long to ride up there?" she said. "An hour in good weather." He looked at the sky again. "Less than that to bring the weather down on top of us. Then we need to go now." He turned and looked at her. She could see him forming the response, the practical assessment of whether taking her made sense versus leaving her at the ranch. She could see the calculation. "I can ride," she said. "I told you that when I arrived, and you didn't ask me to prove it. So I'm telling you again, you need 2 people to move a herd out of a box canyon. Duro isn't back from the east fence." He looked at her for another second. "Can you ride hard?" "Yes." "In snow?" "I grew up in Pennsylvania," she said. "It snows there." He went to saddle the horses. She went inside and added a 3rd layer at her core, packed a saddlebag with what she could think of, quickly rope, a tin of matches, 2 pieces of wrapped bread from yesterday's bake, a small flask of whiskey for warmth, the extra bandage linen from her medical kit because she'd learned to bring it. She wrapped her hands in wool liners under her gloves. She tied the kerchief over her ears under her hat. When she came out, Jed had 2 horses ready. He'd given her the stockier of the 2, a gray mare with deep shoulders built for endurance over speed, which was the right choice for a rider he hadn't seen in action yet. She went to the mare without comment and checked the girth herself before she mounted, because checking the girth yourself is basic sense. The cinch was already tight. She mounted and settled. Jed watched her mount. His expression didn't change, but he looked away quickly and nudged his horse toward the north gate, which she took as approval. They rode. The first 20 minutes were fast and open, across the flat scrubland at a pace that ate up ground. The sky descended as they rode, the gray coming down in layers, and by the time the land started rising toward the canyon, approach as the first snow was coming in, not heavy yet, but heavy enough, fine and sideways, driven by a wind that had teeth. Birdie tucked her chin and rode. She'd ridden through worse. The coal camps sat at the base of ridges that channeled mountain weather directly onto them, and supply runs in bad winters had meant hours, in conditions that made this first push feel mild. What mattered was keeping the horse moving at the right pace, fast enough to reach the herd, not so fast that you burned the animal out before the work started. Jed set a good pace, not reckless, not cautious, experienced. She matched him, and he didn't look back to check, which meant he'd registered that she was there and keeping up. The land rose. The wind got worse. The snow thickened. By the time the canyon entrance came into view, visibility was down to 50 yards and falling. Birdie could hear the herd before she could see them, the low, anxious sounds that cattle make when they're confused, and the weather is pressing in, and they want to move, but don't know where. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and came out distorted, which was making them more agitated. They rode in. The herd was about 60 head, gathered in the upper half of the canyon, and milling in the way, spooked cattle mill, turning in on themselves, pushing against each other, the ones on the outside, pressing into the stone walls. The snow was already an inch deep on the floor, and coming faster in the enclosed space. Jed pulled up and assessed it quickly. "We need to split them. If they all try to go through the entrance at once, they'll pile up. I'll take the left side, push the first half through. You hold the right side back until I've got clear ground, then drive your half after. Understood. Whistle when you want me to move. 2 short whistles. Move on the second. He went left. She went right. Cattle work, at its core, is about pressure and release. You apply pressure from one direction and create a clear release point in another. And the animal moves toward the release because it wants the pressure to stop. It requires patience, and it requires reading the animal. A frightened herd that has been standing in cold wind requires more patience than usual because they're already at the edge of their calm, and one wrong move tips them from moving correctly into moving in every direction at once. Birdie kept the mare at a steady walk. No sudden moves. She worked the right edge of the herd with pressure that was consistent and calm, pushing them left toward Jed's half without triggering a full panic. The cattle on her side began moving, reluctantly, then with more purpose. She heard 2 short whistles. She pushed. The herd broke for the entrance. It wasn't elegant, but it was controlled. Jed had the left side moving in a column, and she pushed her half in behind, and the sound in the canyon went from anxious milling to the purposeful thunder of animals going somewhere. Snow flew up under the hooves. The cold hit full force in the entrance as they passed through it. On the open ground below the canyon, Jed turned his horse, and she turned hers, and they worked the herd together, pushing them down the slope toward the ranch at a pace the animals could sustain. The snow was coming hard now, full storm. The wind was driving it horizontally, and visibility was down to 30 yards, then 20. The herd moved. She and Jed rode the edges, keeping them together, correcting the ones that wanted to split off. It took 40 minutes to get them down to the lower pasture where the lee of the ridge and the windbreak of the old tree line gave enough shelter to be workable. They ran the herd into the enclosed section, and Jed dropped from his horse to chain the gate, and Birdie held the position until the last straggler was through. The gate closed. She sat on the horse in the snow and breathed. Her face was numb from the ears down. Her hands were functional, but barely, the cold having worked through the wool liners in the last 20 minutes. The snow was 4 inches deep and still coming fast. Jed appeared beside her on foot, leading his horse. He looked at her face. "We can't make the ranch," he said. "Not in this. There's a line shack, 1/4 mile east. We ride for it now." She didn't argue. She turned the mare east. The 1/4 mile was longer than it sounded in that wind. The shack materialized out of the white, like something she'd imagined, low-roofed, stone-walled, a dark gap that was the door. They got the horses into the lean-to-shelter on the south side, which was out of the worst of the wind. Jed broke the ice in the water trough for them. She pulled feed from the storage box, nailed to the shelter wall. Old hay, but dry. They went inside. The shack was small, 1 room, stone walls, a plank floor, a cold iron stove in the corner with a short stack of wood beside it, a rope bunk against one wall, 2 heavy wool blankets folded on a shelf, a lantern, no window. Jed had the stove going in 4 minutes. He knew where everything was, which meant he'd been here before, probably several times. The fire took and began pushing heat into the small space, and Birdie stood close to it and worked her fingers inside her gloves, trying to get the feeling back. She pulled the bread out of the saddlebag, unwrapped it, found it partially frozen. She set it on top of the stove to warm. Jed set his wet coat on the single nail by the door and stood by the stove. He was favoring his right side. She noticed the ribs. She'd redressed the wound that morning and it had been looking better, but the hard riding in cold air had tightened everything up. "Ribs?" she said. "Fine. You're holding your arm funny." "It's fine," he said again. She let it go for the moment. The temperature in the shack climbed. Slow outside, the storm hit its full force. They could hear it working against the stone walls, the wind finding every gap. The fire popped and settled into a steady burn. Birdie pulled off her outer coat and draped it near the stove. Her hands were warming up, pins and needles working through the fingers, which was unpleasant but correct. She flexed them and waited. Jed sat down on the bunk. Then he sat down more heavily than he intended. And she looked at him, and he was gray around the mouth. "Jed, I'm cold," he said. She crossed the shack in 2 steps and put her hand to his forehead. "Cold, Clammy. Not the cold of a man who has been in the snow. The cold of a man whose body is struggling to maintain its own heat. When did you start feeling this?" she said. "Writing down," he said. "You should have said so. We had 60 head to move." She pulled the wool blankets off the shelf. They were heavy, quality wool, and dry. She shook them out. "Your outer layers need to come off," she said. "Wet clothes against skin will make this worse. The wool blankets will hold heat, but not if there's wet fabric between you and them." He looked at her. "You're going into hypothermia," she said plainly. "I have seen it before. The protocol is heat and dry insulation, and it needs to happen now. Take the wet things off." He worked at his coat and shirt. His hands weren't coordinating well, which told her the hypothermia was already affecting his fine motor function. She helped with the buttons without making an event of it. When he was down to dry underlayers, she said, "Lie down," and he lay down on the bunk, and she put both blankets over him. His body was still losing the fight with the cold. She could see it. The blankets were dry wool, which was good, but the shack was still warming up, and he needed core heat now. She pulled off her outer layers to her dry wool undergarments. She understood the physiology of it. When someone is losing core temperature, the fastest recovery comes from direct contact with another warm body, transferring heat directly, rather than waiting for the environment to warm enough to do the job. It was not complicated, and it was not a choice. It was medicine. She got under the blankets with him, facing the same direction, and pulled the wool tight around both of them. He was very cold against her back. She could feel the shivering in him, deep and involuntary, the body doing what it does when it's trying to generate heat through movement. She was not cold. She ran warm, always had, a fact she'd been mocked for at various points in her life, and which now was simply useful. The shack continued to warm. The fire was doing its job. The storm was loud against the walls. The shivering in him began to ease. It took time. She lay still and let her body do what it was doing, transferring heat steadily, and outside the storm was enormous, and inside the shack was just them and the sound of the fire. He spoke after a while, quietly and without any particular lead-up. "Her name was Catalina," he said. "She waited. My wife. She came out from San Antonio. She understood what the ranch was. She knew the territory." He was quiet for a moment. "3 men came while I was at the south fence. Sterling's men, before I even knew it was Sterling. They were looking for the deed. She wouldn't tell them where it was." Another silence. She was alone. Birdie was very still. "I've thought for 6 years about what I could have done," he said. "What I should have done. If I'd come back an hour earlier. If I'd left the deed with the sheriff. If I hadn't taken the south fence job that week." He breathed slowly. "You go over it enough times, and it stops being a real memory and becomes something else. Something you're building over and over instead of remembering." "Yes," Birdie said quietly. "I know what that is. The 3 women who came after her, I understand why they left. I was not trying to keep them. I told myself it was practical, and it was never practical." "You were keeping people away before they could be hurt," she said. He didn't answer right away, then or before I had to lose something again. The fire shifted and settled. "The superintendent I broke my arm against," Birdie said. "The one in Pennsylvania. He'd been working up to it for months. Small things first. Comments. Then he started blocking my pay, docking hours I'd worked, putting his hands on my shoulder when I was at the ledger. I kept thinking it would stop. I kept thinking the situation would resolve itself without me having to make it worse." She paused. "One night, he cornered me in the supply room. I had a ledger book in my hand. I swung it when he came at me and caught his arm wrong, and it broke. She was matter-of-fact about it. It was self-defense, and I told the constable it was self-defense. And nobody believed me, because he was the superintendent and I was just the large woman who managed the kitchen and was never going to be married anyway. So what did it matter? Jed was very quiet. I left because staying would have meant a trial where they made it into something it wasn't, she said. And I didn't run. I want to be clear about that distinction. I left. I chose where I was going, and I packed what I needed, and I got on a train. Those are different things. Yes, he said, they are. The storm outside was at its peak, roaring against the stone, and inside the shack, the two blankets held the heat between them, and the fire burned steady, and the horses in the lean-to shelter shifted and stamped, and were out of the worst of it. She didn't know when she slept. She was warm, and the fire was there, and the weight of the days, the tallow, the flu, the ride, the cold settled over her, and at some point the storm became just a sound. And the sound became something she was hearing from a distance. When she woke, gray light was coming under the door. The storm was over. Jed was awake already, facing the same direction she was, and the shack was warm, and the fire had burned to deep red coals. She could feel that he'd been awake for a while, lying still the way people lie still when they don't want to disturb something. She got up carefully and added wood to the fire and went to check the horses. The world outside was white and silent. The sky was scrubbed clean the way it always is, after a big storm, blue and hard and brilliant, and the snow on the ground was deep and still and unmarked, except for a line of small bird tracks near the lean-to wall. The horses were fine, cold, but fine. She checked their feet for ice packing between the frogs and found nothing serious. She gave them the rest of the hay from the storage box. She went back inside. Jed was sitting up on the bunk, both blankets over his shoulders. His color was back. The gray was gone from his face, and his eyes were clear and present. He was looking at the stove. The herd made it down, he said. They did, she agreed. The horses are all right? Fine. He looked at her. She was standing in the small room with the cold still in her clothes from the few minutes outside, and the fire was building back up, and the bread she'd set on the stove last night was warm, if a bit singed on one side. You should have come with a better situation, he said. It came out rough, like on something he'd been turning over in the dark for a while. She looked at him steadily. You came to this territory expecting a stable household, he said, a working arrangement. Instead, you've got Sterling's men in the yard, and a man who can't stay warm on his own, and a ranch that has more problems than I put in the letter. She was quiet for a moment. The letter listed difficulties, she said. It didn't claim otherwise. She took the bread off the stove, broke it in two, handed him the larger piece. Eat that. You need the warmth, he took it. She sat on the stool near the fire and ate her half and looked at the door, at the line of light under it. Jed, she said. He looked at her. I've been told my whole life that I'm too much for the situation I'm standing in. Too large, too plain, too stubborn, too competent, in ways that made people around me uncomfortable. She looked at the fire. I spent a long time wondering if they were right. Coming west was partly about stopping that wondering. She looked at him. This valley, this ranch, this mess with Sterling, none of that scares me. Staying in a situation, smaller than I am, that was the thing that scared me. Jed looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say anything. Sometimes the honest things don't need an answer. They just need to be said and heard, and the hearing is enough. He ate the bread. She ate hers. Outside, the snow lay brilliant and still across the mesa country, and the sky was the hard winter blue that follows the worst storms and promises, without sentimentality, that the sun is still there and will do its work. 3 weeks after the blizzard, the valley looked like it was trying to pretend the storm had never happened. The snow had retreated to the high ground, staying on the mesa cap and in the north-facing gullies where the sun didn't reach. The lower pastures were brown and winter dry but open, and the herd moved through them without trouble. The creek running off the mesa's east face was running clean and full from the snowmelt, which was the thing that mattered most, because that creek fed the spring, and the spring fed everything. Life at Black Mesa had settled into something that resembled a rhythm. Not a peaceful one, exactly. Peaceful wasn't the right word for a ranch, with Sterling's shadow permanently on the east fence, and Vogel's men making slow passes along the road every few days, like they were keeping inventory. But it was a working rhythm which Birdie had learned, long ago, was worth considerably more than peaceful. She rose before dawn and had the stove going before Jed came down. He'd stopped looking surprised by this, somewhere in the second week. They ate breakfast with the account books, open between them, more mornings than not. Birdie going through the new ledger she'd set up, showing him where the money was moving and where it was leaking. He'd started asking questions, which was a change from the first week, when he'd looked at the ledgers, the way he looked at things he didn't entirely trust. He trusted them now. He trusted her numbers, which for Birdie was a more significant thing than it might appear to someone who hadn't spent a decade fighting to be taken seriously in rooms full of men who assumed her size meant her mind worked slower. Duro had started eating dinner at the main table rather than the bunkhouse, which happened gradually enough that nobody formally decided it. Martha, the widow woman, who held the small tenant parcel on the ranch's south edge, had come by twice with her grandson Toby to trade preserved goods for flour, and both times Birdie had sat Toby at the kitchen table and let him look at the ledger books while she explained what the columns meant. He was 10 and quick and had a left leg that hadn't developed correctly, and he moved through the world with the particular alertness of a child who has learned that sitting still and listening is how you stay useful. The second time Martha came, she'd looked at Toby bent over the ledger page while Birdie explained debits, and she'd looked at Birdie, and she hadn't said anything. She'd just pressed Birdie's hand once before she left. The supply run to Oakhaven had gone the way Birdie expected. She'd stood at the mercantile counter with a pencil and a list and counted every pound out loud while the clerk measured it, and the clerk had gotten increasingly uncomfortable, and the quantities had been exactly what they were billed as, which told her that the discrepancy she'd found in the old receipts was not a coincidence, but a deliberate choice that someone was now electing not to repeat in front of a witness. She'd made note of it in the ledger. Documentation for when the situation changed, as she'd told Jed it was for. The Tuesday, she went to town. For the second supply run was a clear day, cold but bright, the kind of late autumn morning that makes the territory look like it was designed to be beautiful and can afford to be indifferent about whether anyone notices. She rode in alone because Jed was needed at the ranch, and Duro was repairing the section of north fence that kept giving way, and because Birdie was not in the habit of requiring an escort to conduct business in a town she'd now visited 4 times without incident. She left the horse at the livery and went to the mercantile first. The mercantile transaction went without event. Same clerk, same careful measuring, same uncomfortable silence while she counted. She collected the goods, arranged for the heavier items to be held for pickup, and walked across to the dry goods store for the specific grade of sand she needed for the chimney liner repair. She was on her way back to the livery, carrying the smaller parcels, when she heard voices she recognized. Vogel's was one of them. He was standing on the far side of the mercantile porch, with 2 men she didn't know by name, but had seen before. The particular category of man who holds his coat open to show what's on his hip on purpose. They were watching her come down the boardwalk from half a block away. She kept walking. Beside Vogel, another man stepped out from the shadow of the porch overhang. This one was different city coat, paper collar, the kind of boots that have never been near a working ranch. He had a document in his hand. Miss Burke, he said it pleasantly. Miss Bernadette Burke, formerly of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. She stopped. Her mind had already started moving through possibilities before her feet stopped, which was a habit she'd developed over years of situations that turned bad without adequate warning time. That depends on who's asking, she said. The man in the city coat produced a fold of papers. My name is Aldous Crane. representing the office of Sterling Land Holdings. I have here an extradition warrant issued by the County Court of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, charging one Bernadette Burke with attempted murder and payroll theft, both offenses dating to approximately 14 months ago. Birdie stood on the Oak Haven boardwalk and looked at the papers. She did not reach for them. She knew, with the clarity that comes from being very calm, in the middle of something alarming, that the papers were false. She had not committed payroll theft. She had never had access to payroll at the last camp because they hadn't trusted her with it, despite her running the entire kitchen operation, which had always been an irony, she'd noticed, without finding particularly funny. And the self-defense case had been dropped. She had a letter from the Schuylkill County Constable's office confirming the matter closed. That letter was at the ranch. The warrant in Crane's hand existed because Sterling had contacts in Pennsylvania who could manufacture paperwork, which was a thing men like Sterling could do when they had enough money and enough patience and a specific person they needed removed from a specific piece of land. The two men beside Vogel had both taken a small step forward. She looked past Crane and registered them fully. Not local hired hands. Something else. The way they were standing, the way their eyes were moving. These were professional bounty men, men who collected fees for bodies, and for whom the distinction between a living body and a dead one was primarily a paperwork question. Vogel was watching her with his pale eyes and a slight smile. There are also, Crane said, pulling another sheet from behind the first, sworn vouchers from 3 witnesses stating that Miss Burke was paid by persons unknown to obtain, by fraudulent means, the water deed to Black Mesa Ranch for transfer to Sterling Land Holdings. That's a fabrication, Birdie said. The witnesses are documented, Crane said pleasantly. The witnesses are paid, she said. There's a difference, and a territorial court would see it. Perhaps, Crane said. But in the meantime, the warrant is valid on its face and binding in this territory. I'm afraid you'll need to come with these gentlemen. Vogel stepped off the porch. The two men moved to flank her. Birdie held very still. She understood the geometry of it with precision. She had parcels in her hands, which meant her hands weren't free. The two bounty men were close and positioned deliberately. Vogel was behind them but watching. Main Street, midday, a handful of people on the boardwalk who had already noticed the confrontation and were doing what people do, slowing down, not committing to involvement, waiting to see which direction it went. Fighting here was not survivable. That was the plain arithmetic of it. Not because she couldn't put up a fight, but because the bounty men were there precisely to create an excuse, and an excuse was all Vogel needed. A woman resisting arrest, 2 professional men with legal paperwork, the outcome of that calculation only went one direction. She didn't move. I'll go with the sheriff, she said. Not with these men. Crane looked at Vogel. Some exchange passed between them. The warrant authorizes these deputies, Crane started. Those are not deputies, Birdie said. She looked at the men directly. A deputy is a sworn officer of a jurisdiction. These men are private contractors. I'll go with Sheriff Miller, or I'll stand here on a public street until one of you does something that this town's people can witness clearly. It was a calculated risk. She was betting that Vogel wanted her removed quietly, not dramatically, and that a public scene involving a woman being physically taken by 2 obvious hired men would create the kind of attention that complicated things for Sterling. Vogel said something low to Crane. Crane straightened his papers. The sheriff will be notified. In the meantime, you'll wait at the jail. She went. She walked between the 2 men down the main street, and she did not look at the people watching from the boardwalk, because looking invited commentary, and commentary invited incident, and she needed this to move forward without incident. She focused on keeping her breathing steady, and her face neutral. She knew how to do that. She'd done it in rooms full of men who thought her fear was an entertainment. Sheriff Miller was in his office. He was a broad, tired man in his late 60s, with a lawman's permanent squint and the particular demeanor of someone who has been forced to make too many compromises and knows it. He looked at the papers Crane put on his desk, looked at Birdie, looked at Vogel standing in his doorway. "These are extradition papers," Miller said. He was reading carefully, which Birdie noted as a point in his favor. "From Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania," Crane confirmed. On the charges stated. Miller looked at Birdie. "Do you have anything to say to these charges?" "I have documentation at the ranch that refutes the murder charge. The payroll theft charge is fabricated entirely. The vouchers concerning the water deed are false." She held Miller's gaze. "I need someone to ride to Black Mesa Ranch and bring back the document folder from the third shelf in the kitchen. There's a letter from the Schuylkill County Constable's office confirming the self-defense matter was closed." Miller looked at the papers again. He was thinking. She could see him thinking. And underneath the thinking, she could see the weight of whatever arrangement he had with Sterling's people pressing against whatever was left of his original intentions as a lawman. "Until the documentation can be verified," he said carefully. "I'll need to hold you." "I understand," she said. What she understood was that he was doing the best he could inside a situation that had already closed around him, and that pushing against him directly would only close it tighter. He led her back to the single cell. It was a stone room, narrow. A cot, a bucket, a small window set high in the wall that let in a rectangle of afternoon light, and nothing else. The door was iron-barred, and it locked with a sound she felt through the floor. She sat on the cot, she thought. She thought carefully and without panic, because panic is the least useful thing in a small room, and she had always known that. She organized what she knew. The warrant was false, but falseness required evidence to overcome, and her evidence was at the ranch. Someone needed to get that evidence. Miller was compromised, but not entirely without scruple. The bounty men were here for Crane and Sterling, not for the law. Vogel had choreographed this, which meant it was planned, which meant it had a purpose beyond simply jailing her. The purpose, she concluded, was twofold. Remove her from the ranch, which removed a witness and a defender, and use her as leverage against Jed, either to force him to the deed or to break his position by isolating him. She also thought about the water deed vouchers, the accusation that she'd been paid to steal the deed. That was new. That accusation wasn't just about removing her, it was about Jed. It was designed so that even if he came to her defense, the act of doing so would look like a guilty man protecting a co-conspirator. It was, she admitted to herself, quite well constructed. She had been sitting for perhaps 2 hours when she heard the front office door open, and Vogel's voice and Miller's voice in an exchange that she couldn't fully make out. Then quiet, then the outer door again. More time passed. The rectangle of light from the high window moved across the floor as the afternoon went on. She did not pace. Pacing is for people trying to outrun their thoughts, and her thoughts were doing exactly what she needed them to do. She was thinking about the water deed vouchers again when she heard the outer door a third time, and this time it was different. This time there was a specific quality to the sound, heavier, more deliberate. The sound of someone who had been moving fast and had just stopped. Then Jed's voice, low and controlled, which she now knew meant he was at the extreme edge of himself. She couldn't hear the words. She heard Miller's voice responding, a longer reply, and then quiet. Then footsteps. The iron door at the back of the office opened, and Jed was there, on the other side of the bars. He was covered in trail dust from a fast ride. His hat was in his hand. He was looking at her. His expression was not what she expected. She had expected anger, or concern, or the particular ferocity she'd seen in his face when Vogel's men were in the yard. Instead, he looked at her with something that was almost painful to see, controlled and deliberate in a way that cost him visibly. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He held her gaze. She could see him working through something that had already been decided, and that he was now executing with the precision of a man who knows the cost and is paying it anyway. There are 2 bounty men in the saloon, he said quietly. Crane is with them. If you resist, if this becomes a public confrontation, those men will use it. Miller can't hold them off you if you give them reason. I know, she said. I know that. I didn't resist. I know you didn't, Miller told me. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then back at her. I need you to stay here tonight. She went very still. The documentation you need is at the ranch, she said carefully. I know where it is. Then go get it. I will, he said. But I need you here, and I need you safe. And the safest place in this town right now is behind Miller's bars, because those men will not do anything to a prisoner in lawful custody that Miller can witness. He reached through the bars then. His hand found hers. He gripped it once, hard for a second, then let go. His face had gone back to that controlled, deliberate blankness. Jed, she said. He looked at her. Don't do anything I can't undo, she said. Something crossed his face. It was quick and complicated, and she couldn't read all of it. He stepped back. He turned to go. And she understood, in the few seconds before the iron door closed behind him, that what she'd seen in his face when he stepped back was not coldness. It was the expression of a man doing the hardest thing he knows how to do, which is trusting someone else with the outcome of something that matters. The iron door shut. She heard his boots on the office floor. She heard him say something to Miller, short and direct. She heard Miller respond. She heard the outer door open and close, and then she heard nothing. The office was quiet. The street outside was quiet. The rectangle of light on the floor had moved to the far wall and was starting to go orange with the late afternoon. She sat on the cot. For the first time since the boardwalk, she let herself be afraid. Not for long. Just for a moment, in the privacy of the stone room, she sat with the full weight of it, the bars, the warrant with her name on it, the bounty men in the saloon, and Jed walking out of the jail into a situation he'd chosen to walk into alone. She was afraid because she was not in control of what happened next, and she had spent 32 years engineering situations where she was always in control of what happened next. She breathed through it. Then she put it away. She lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about the water deed vouchers and the specific legal language Crane had used and what would be required to challenge it. And she went through the argument, step by step, the way she'd gone through the accounts and the flu and the tallow, the way she went through every problem that was real and needed solving. She was still going through it when the light faded entirely and the cell went dark. Outside, somewhere down the street, a door opened and music came out of it briefly and then was shut away. A horse went past at a walk. Someone laughed at a distance. She heard, very faintly from the front office, Miller striking a match to light his lamp. The ordinary sounds of a town at night, going about its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to the woman in the cell, and the man riding hard into the dark, somewhere between here and the territorial capital, carrying affidavits and a cash bond and whatever was left of everything he had to stake. She pulled the thin blanket up. She did not sleep, but she rested. And she held on to the thing she knew with more certainty than she could have explained, which was that Jedidiah Colter was not riding away from her. He was riding toward something she was waiting on the other side of, and the bars between them were temporary. She was sure of it. She had to be. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock the following morning. Birdie knew this because Miller told her at dawn when he brought coffee and a plate of beans, sliding them through the gap under the cell door with the practiced movement of a man who has done this enough times that it has become mechanical. He told her, without looking at her directly, which was how Miller communicated anything that made him uncomfortable, which was most things relating to this situation. What judge? She said. Fitch, Miller said. He was looking at the wall above her head. Rides the circuit out of Santa Fe. He's been in Oak Haven since yesterday. She knew the name. She'd heard it twice in her weeks, at the ranch, once from Jed, once from Duro, and both times attached to Sterling's name in the same sentence. A circuit judge who appeared in Oak Haven with reliable convenience whenever Sterling needed a legal outcome. "Where's the hearing?" she said. Miller paused. "The saloon. Fitch uses it when the proceedings are." He stopped. "Informal," she said. "When the main hall isn't available," he said. She drank the coffee. It was bad, but it was hot. She thought about what a saloon hearing meant. It meant no formal record keeper, unless Fitch chose to appoint one. It meant spectators who could be selected or discouraged. It meant an environment that Fitch and Sterling's people controlled completely, where the normal architecture of a courtroom, the raised bench, the separation of parties, the procedural formality that kept things from becoming a performance, was entirely absent. She handed the empty cup back under the door and said nothing else. Miller left. She braided her hair and straightened her clothes, as well as a night, in a jail cell allowed, which wasn't much, but she did it because how you present yourself when people are trying to reduce you is a form of argument. She had learned that in coal camp offices, in supply rooms, in every room where she'd been the largest person and the least expected to have anything useful to say. At 9:30, Crane came. He had 2 men with him, one of them a bounty man from the saloon. They walked her out of the cell and through the main office, where Miller was sitting at his desk, looking at paperwork he wasn't reading. He didn't look up when she passed. The street was cold and bright. A few people on the boardwalk stopped to watch. She walked between the men without being held. They hadn't touched her, and she hadn't given them reason to. And the distance from the jail to the saloon was half a block that felt longer. Inside, the saloon had been rearranged in the way of places that are pretending to be something they aren't. Tables pushed back to create a central space, chairs set in rows. A larger table at the far end where Fitch would sit. Already occupied by the judge himself, a compact man with round spectacles and a very fine coat that was doing its best to make him look more substantial than he was. Sterling was there. She hadn't seen him in person before. She'd built a picture of him from descriptions and from the architecture of his influence, the way you build a picture of a machine from its outputs. The man himself was older than she'd expected, late 60s, with a rancher's weathered skin and a merchant's careful eyes. He was dressed in the kind of clothing that costs enough to be quiet about it. He sat at a side table with 2 men she didn't recognize, and he looked at her the way people look at problems that are almost resolved. Vogel was at the back wall. The bounty men were near the door. Crane took a position near Fitch's table and began arranging papers. The spectators were a mix. Some genuine townspeople who'd come out of curiosity or boredom, or the particular hunger people sometimes have, for watching things go wrong for someone else. Some Sterlings, she was certain, positioned to create a sense of crowd weight. Birdie was put in a chair facing Fitch's table. Not the kind of chair that was at a desk or behind a partition. Just a chair in the open middle of the room, positioned so that everyone present could see her from all sides. She understood the staging immediately. She was meant to feel exposed. She was meant to understand that there were no walls between her and all the eyes in the room, that she was on display. It was a deliberate choice, and it would work on people who were already halfway to believing they had something to hide. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Fitch. Fitch called the proceedings to order with the brisk efficiency of a man who considers the outcome already established and is primarily interested in completing the paperwork on time. Crane presented the charges, the same charges as the day before, delivered now with the added weight of the room and the formal language Crane used well, the particular legal phrasing that sounds more authoritative the less you know about what it actually means. Attempted murder. Payroll theft. He spoke for 10 minutes. He cited the Pennsylvania warrant. He cited the vouchers from the 3 witnesses. He described with careful vagueness the claim that Birdie had been placed at Black Mesa Ranch as a paid agent of persons unknown, tasked with obtaining the water deed by fraudulent means. She listened to all of it. Then Fitch looked at her over his round spectacles. Miss Burke. You'll have the opportunity to respond to these charges in due course. First, for the purpose of establishing identification, we'll need to verify. Your Honor, the man beside Fitch, she'd taken him for a clerk, leaned in and said something at low volume. Fitch adjusted his spectacles. His expression was neutral in a way that had been practiced. For verification of identity and the documentation of specific identifying marks as referenced in the warrant, the court will require.
No.
The word came out flat and clear, and it stopped Fitch mid-sentence. Birdie stood up. She was aware that standing wasn't what the situation called for, procedurally. She stood anyway, because she had been sitting in that exposed chair long enough to establish that she hadn't been afraid of it, and now she had something to say, and she was going to say it on her feet. The warrant, she said, and her voice carried the room without effort, because she had spent 11 years being heard over industrial kitchen noise. References identifying marks for the purposes of verifying my identity. I am Bernadette Burke. My identity is not in question and has not been questioned by anyone in this proceeding until this moment. What is being requested is not identity verification. She looked at Fitch directly. What is being requested is a public examination of my person in this room, in front of these men, for no purpose that serves this proceeding. The room was quiet. Fitch's expression had not changed. The warrant specifies. The warrant was obtained fraudulently, and its specifications are irrelevant to a legitimate proceeding, she said. If this court intends to conduct a genuine hearing, then conduct it. Present the evidence, allow me to respond to it, and produce the witnesses who signed those vouchers so that I may examine them directly. She looked across the room. She found Sterling at his side table. You don't want the truth, she said, and her voice was steady as the mesa behind the ranch. You want an exhibition because a woman who doesn't cower before your arrogance terrifies you. Sterling's expression didn't move. His eyes did. The room had gone to the particular silence of a space where everyone is very alert and nobody wants to be the one to break it. Fitch opened his mouth. The saloon doors came open. They came open the way doors come open when someone hits them without slowing down both panels, hard, swinging wide, and crashing against the interior walls, with a sound that went through the room like a shot. Jed walked in. He was trail dirty from a hard ride, dust on his coat and his hat and his face, and he'd been in the saddle all night because there was no other way to have left last evening and be here now. He looked like a man who has spent 12 hours on horseback and is running on the particular fuel that lives past exhaustion, past tiredness, past everything ordinary, the fuel that comes from having one specific thing left to do. He walked to Fitch's table. He reached into his coat and pulled out a document case, flat leather, the kind used for legal papers, and opened it and placed the contents on the table in front of Fitch. Not threw them, not dropped them, placed them with precision. Certified affidavits, he said. His voice was controlled and hard and very quiet. From the Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania Constable's office confirming the self-defense matter involving Miss Burke was reviewed, found to be justified, and closed without charges 14 months ago. He put a second document down, a sworn statement from the paymaster at the Colville camp, third camp of Miss Burke's employment, confirming the full integrity of the payroll records during her tenure here, and the absence of any reported theft. A third document, and a territorial cash bond, drawn on the First Bank of Santa Fe, guaranteeing Miss Burke's appearance before any legitimate court proceeding in this territory. He straightened up and looked at Fitch. The warrant is false, he said. The witnesses on those vouchers are Sterling's employees, which I can document if this court can find the integrity to look at documentation. And the claim that Miss Burke was paid to steal my water deed is a fabrication designed to remove a witness and a legal resident from private property in order to advance Sterling's seizure of territorial water rights. Fitch was looking at the documents. The room was very still. Crane started to speak. Your Honor, the affidavits would need to be verified before? They're certified, Jed said. He didn't look at Crane. The certification seal is from the territorial clerk's office in Santa Fe. I was there last night. They were open early. The clerk on duty was very helpful. Sterling had not moved from his side table. He was looking at Jed with the eyes of a man recalibrating and doing it quickly. Fitch picked up the first affidavit and read it. He took his time. The room waited. Birdie stood in the center of the room and watched the judge's face and did not sit back down. Then Fitch put the document flat on the table. "The identification verification request is withdrawn," he said. His voice had changed slightly, a new careful quality in it. The quality of a man who has just noticed the ground is less solid than he thought. "The court will review the certified documentation." He looked at Crane. "Mr. Crane, do you have independent verification of the witness signatures on the vouchers?" Crane looked at Sterling. Sterling gave no visible signal. He didn't need to. Crane was already answering by the fact that he was looking for one. "The witnesses are available to testify," Crane said, which was not an answer to the question. "Can you produce them today?" Fitch said. A pause. "They are not currently in Oak Haven," Crane said. "Then the vouchers are uncorroborated hearsay," Fitch said. He didn't say it with any particular feeling. He said it like a man quietly choosing which side of a calculation to stand on now that the calculation had changed. Jed put a fourth document on the table. "The bond," he said, "Miss Burke's release." Fitch looked at the bond. He looked at the room. He looked, briefly, at Sterling. And Sterling's face gave him nothing. And Birdie watched Fitch make the final calculation. "The court finds insufficient grounds to hold Miss Burke under the presented warrant, pending the certification review," Fitch said. "She is released on the posted bond with the condition that she remain in the territory and available to the court." He struck the table once with his palm, because there was no gavel. The room exhaled. Crane gathered his papers with the specific efficiency of a man controlling how much he lets anything show. The bounty men near the door looked at each other, and then at Crane, and got nothing from either exchange that told them what to do, so they did nothing. Vogel, at the back wall, was looking at Jed. Jed was looking at Birdie. She walked across the room to him. She didn't hurry. She walked at the same pace. She walked everywhere, steady and deliberate. And she stopped beside him and looked at the documents on Fitch's table. "Santa Fe," she said quietly. "You rode to Santa Fe." "Territorial clerk's office," he said. His voice had dropped to something only she could hear. "The constable's letter from your file was enough to get the certification. The bank took the land as collateral for the bond." She looked at him. He was exhausted under the dust and the control. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened overnight, and his hands, she noticed, had steadied only recently the very slight tremor of someone who has been running on the extreme end of themselves and has just now been given permission to stop. He had put Black Mesa up as her bond. He had put the ranch, Catalina's ranch, his father's land, the water and the stone, and the 6 years of holding on the table for her release. She didn't say what came to her mind first, because what came first was too large for a saloon with Sterling watching and Vogel at the back wall. "You need to sleep," she said. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something quieter than that. "I need breakfast," he said. "Then let's go." She turned for the door. People moved out of the way. She noticed this peripherally, the small shift of bodies creating space. And it was different from the shift of bodies creating space to avoid a large, inconvenient woman, which was what she'd been used to. This was different, and she noted the difference and kept walking. Jed gathered the documents from Fitch's table. He moved with the deliberateness of someone who is not going to leave anything important behind in a room like this. He tucked them back into the case. Sterling spoke. He said it quietly, from his side table, not standing, not raising his voice. He said it in the tone of a man making a note, rather than issuing a threat, which was in some ways more unpleasant than a threat. "Mr. Colter," he said, "you've bought time, not resolution." Jed stopped. He turned and looked at Sterling from across the room. The distance between them was maybe 20 feet, and it felt like something more fundamental than distance. The spring feeds 7 families in this valley, Jed said. 7 families, and their stock and their future. Every one of them knows it. Every one of them knows your name and what you're after. He looked at the old man in the fine coat with the careful eyes. You've been working on this for years, and you have not yet managed to take a spring that's been on this land for longer than you've been in this territory. Think about what that means. Sterling said nothing. Jed turned back and walked to the door. Birdie was already on the boardwalk in the cold, bright morning, and he came out beside her, and they stood there. For a moment, both of them. The street was ordinary. A wagon going past, a dog crossing unhurriedly, the mountains in the far distance with their snow caps doing what mountains do, which is persist. Miller, Birdie said. He'll get a copy of the release, Jed said. I'll drop it at the office. He tried, she said, in his way. Jed was quiet for a moment. He's a man who got to the edge of something a long time ago and couldn't step back across it. He spent the time since then making small gestures. He looked at the street. I don't have much patience for it, but I understand it. She looked at him. You stake the ranch, she said. He looked back at her. Yes, he said simply. If I'd run, she said. If I'd panicked or fought in the street and given them their reason, you'd have lost it. You didn't, he said. But if I had, he was quiet for a moment. Then you didn't, he said again, because you're not someone who panics and runs. I knew that before I rode to Santa Fe. She stood with that. The morning was cold, and the street was ordinary, and the bond was posted, and the warrant was in suspension, and Sterling was still in the saloon, with his careful eyes and his quiet voice, and nothing was resolved. And Jed was standing beside her on the Oakhaven boardwalk, with trail dust on his face, and a leather document case in his hand, and the ranch on the line. Breakfast, she said. Yes, he said. They walked down the street to the small eating house beside the farrier, the one run by a Mexican woman named Enos, who made eggs with chile verde and tortillas that Duro had mentioned twice in the past week. Inside, it was warm, and it smelled like good things cooking, and nobody looked at them with Sterling's calculation or Vogel's cold, pale eyes. Inns put 2 plates down without asking what they wanted, which Birdie appreciated. Jed ate without talking. He ate with the focused attention of someone refueling rather than tasting, which made sense given the night he'd had. Birdie ate more slowly and thought about the documents and about Fitch's face when the calculation had shifted, and about Sterling's quiet voice saying, You've bought time, not resolution. He was right. They'd bought time. What they did with it was the question. She thought about the 7 families Jed had mentioned. The water, the spring. Sterling didn't want just the ranch. He wanted the water that everything downstream depended on. And with the water, he wanted the leverage to own the valley, remove the spring from Jed's control, and he could set terms for every family in the area. That was bigger than a land dispute. That was a valley. She was thinking about this when Jed set down his fork and looked at her across the small table. What are you working through, he said. She looked up. 7 families, she said. You mentioned them to Sterling. Are they organized in any way? Do they know each other's situations? Jed looked at her for a moment. They know each other. They're not organized. They should be, she said. He was quiet. If Sterling takes the spring, he takes it from all of them, she said. Right now, they're dealing with it individually, each one watching their own situation. That's how Sterling wants it. 7 separate problems are manageable. 7 families acting together are a different thing. Jed put his coffee down. What are you thinking? He said. She thought about the coal camps, about what happened when the men stopped grieving their situations individually and started talking to each other across the mess hall table, about what Ava had said once in her broken English, watching the camp boss try to cut rations. You cannot starve 7 men at once. They bite back together. I'm thinking, Birdie said carefully, that water is the kind of thing people will fight for when they understand the fight is shared. She looked at him. But first we need to get home. Home. She'd said it without thinking, and she heard it after the fact. The word sitting between them on the table, next to the empty plates. Jed heard it too. She could tell by the way he didn't react to it, the deliberate quality of his stillness, which was its own kind of reaction. Yes, he said, after a moment. He left money on the table, and they went to collect the horses. The ride back to Black Mesa was quieter than the ride into town had ever been. Not uncomfortable. The quiet of two people who have been through something and are letting it settle rather than talking over it. The mesa came into view an hour out, red and enormous against the winter sky, and Birdie felt the particular pull of a place she had been away from briefly and was now returning to, which was different from simply recognizing a landmark. It was the pull of somewhere that was hers. She kept that to herself, too. They rode through the gate in the late afternoon, and Duro came out of the barn and looked at them both, and looked at Jed's trail dust, and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire and put water on. And Jed came in and sat at the table with the document case in front of him, and she heard him go through the papers once more, quietly, making sure everything was in order, making sure nothing had been left behind or lost or overlooked. She made tea and put a cup in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "Thank you," she said. She said it plain, just those two words, and nothing added to soften or qualify them. He looked at her for a moment. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "I should have been there, you were," she said. "You came." The fire was building in the stove, and the kitchen was warming up, and outside the mesa went dark against the first stars, and inside the lamp on the table pushed the shadows back to the walls, and the document case sat between them on the table, with everything that had happened since yesterday morning folded inside it. Jed put his hand flat on the case. He looked at it. Then he looked up at her, and in his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled deliberateness, not the careful blankness. Something underneath those, something older and less protected. She held his gaze and let him look. The fire settled into its work, and the kitchen held its warmth, and the valley outside was dark and cold and full of the unresolved problems of morning, and none of that was gone, and none of it was small. But in the kitchen, in the lamplight, it was quiet. They smelled the smoke before they saw the flames. Birdie was at the kitchen table when it hit not wood smoke, not the clean smell of the stove, but something thicker and chemical. Tar and scorched timber, and the particular wrongness of a fire that has been started on purpose, rather than by accident. She was up before she'd finished the thought, moving to the window, and what she saw through the glass turned her stomach cold. The eastern outbuilding was gone. Not going, gone. The structure that had held the winter feed stock and the spare equipment was a column of orange and black, fully involved, roaring in the windless dark, with a kind of heat that pushes you back from 30 feet away. The smaller shed beside it, the one she'd repaired the flue on in her first week, had caught on the roof and was burning along the ridgeline. She was out the door with the water buckets before she registered moving. Jed was already in the yard. He'd come from the barn side, and his face in the firelight was hard and still, the face of a man assessing rather than reacting. He took one look at the eastern outbuilding and made the decision she'd already made. The structure was past saving, and fighting the fire there would cost water and time. They needed to protect what was still standing. "The barn?" he said. "I know." Duro appeared from the bunkhouse at a run. The three of them worked the pump and moved water to the barn walls, wetting down the timber to slow the spread if sparks crossed the gap. The gap was 20 feet, which was not much in a hot fire, with even a light wind. There was no wind tonight. That was the only mercy. They worked for 2 hours. The eastern outbuilding burned itself down to its stone foundation. The smaller shed lost its roof, but the walls held. And once the ridge beam collapsed inward, the fire ran out of fuel. The barn did not catch. By midnight, the visible flames were gone, and what remained was the deep orange pulse of embers in the foundation, and the smell, which would be in everything for days. Birdie was sitting on the porch steps when Jed came and stood at the edge of the yard, looking at what was left. His back was to her. He stood there for a long time. She looked at the foundation stones glowing in the dark and thought about what had been in that building. 3 months of winter feed, now ash, the spare saddle equipment, 2 good coils of rope, the replacement fence posts Duro had cut last fall. None of it was irreplaceable. All of it had to be replaced, and placing Canas mas money they were already tight on, and the money they were tight on was already committed to the bond posted for her release, and the bond had been posted against the land. Sterling's arithmetic was clean, she thought. You didn't always need to win outright. Sometimes you just needed to make the cost of holding on high enough that holding on became its own kind of defeat. She heard Jed's boots on the porch. He sat down, not beside her. On the top step, turned slightly away, looking at the yard. Duro had gone to check the herd, which had been spooked by the light and smell and needed settling. Jed was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The bond comes due in 60 days. I know. The feedstock was 2 months of winter supply. I'll have to purchase replacement before the cold comes, and the prices now are." He stopped. He pressed his palm against his knee. The ranch is not in a position to absorb this and service the bond. Birdie looked at the embers. No. He was quiet again. "I have contacts at the Territorial Land Office," he said. "There's a buyer for the north grazing parcel. Not a good price, but enough to cover the bond and the feed replacement if I move quickly." He paused. "It would also mean selling the only water access on the north side of the property, which is exactly what Sterling wants," she said. "Yes." She looked at her hands. Soot and water. The burn scar on her forearm was pale in the firelight. "We need to talk about the families," she said. "Martha and the others. If we can move fast enough, Birdie." She stopped. He stood up. He walked to the far end of the porch and stood with his back to her, one hand on the porch post. The post was old wood, put in by someone before him, sunk deep and solid. He stood with his hand on it and looked out at the burned foundation. She waited. "I want you to take the next stagecoach east," he said. She went very still. "There's gold coin in the strongbox in my office," he continued. His voice was flat and deliberate, the voice he used when he'd already decided something, and was past negotiating it in himself. "Enough to get you to Denver comfortably, and from Denver you can book a proper rail connection anywhere you choose to go." He paused. "I'll write a letter to the agency explaining that the arrangement was ended by mutual agreement. It won't be held against your record." She stood up. "Get out of here," he said. The flatness cracked, just slightly, just enough to hear the thing underneath it. "Staying with me guarantees nothing but blood and ruin. You saw what they did tonight. That's not the end of it. Vogel will come back, and next time it won't just be an outbuilding, and I cannot—" He stopped. His hand tightened on the post. "I cannot keep this situation safe for you. I don't have the resources left to fight Sterling and also to protect you, and I am not willing to let you be in the middle of this when it goes the direction it's going." He reached into his coat. He held out a small leather pouch. The weight of it was visible in how he held it, gold coin, enough to matter. He was holding it out with his arm extended, and his back still turned, which was the posture of a man who has decided something at great cost to himself and needs to execute it before he thinks about it further. She looked at the pouch. She looked at his back, at the hand on the post and the arm extended with the pouch and the rigid set of his shoulders. She walked to him. She took the pouch from his hand, and she slapped it into the mud at the base of the porch steps. It hit with a flat sound, and the leather split slightly, and 2 coins rolled out and caught the ember light and went still. Jed turned around. She grabbed him by the lapels of his coat, both hands, and pulled him down to eye level, because he had height on her, and she needed him where she could look at him directly, and she was not interested in angles right now. His face was very close, firelight on it. All the controlled blankness was gone, stripped off by the night and the fire and the last 6 weeks, and what was under it was raw and frightened and stubborn and more honest than she'd ever seen him. She looked him straight in the eyes. "I spent 30 years," she said, "running from small-minded cowards who treated me like a beast of burden." Her voice was low. It wasn't a speech. It was the plainest thing she knew how to say. "I did not cross this continent to run from a stubborn fool, trying to play the lone martyr." His jaw was tight. He was holding very still in her hands. "This ground drank my sweat," she said, "and your heart is my home." She held his gaze. "I'm not leaving." The yard was quiet. The embers breathed in and out in the foundation. Somewhere in the distance, an owl asked its question and got no answer. Jed's face did something complicated. It moved through several things in a short time, and she felt it rather than saw. It felt it in the slight change in how his coat sat in her hands, the shift from rigid to something that wasn't surrender, but was related to it. The surrender of a man who has been holding himself at a distance from everything that matters and has just run out of reasons to keep doing it. He put his hands over hers, both of them, large, rough, warm, even in the cold night. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She let go of his lapels slowly, and he didn't step back. He stood where he was, close, looking at her, and the firelight moved between them, on the old porch of the old house that her sweat had gone into, and his grief had gone into, and the months of shared work had gone into, until it was no longer his house but theirs in all the ways that matter, and not yet in the official ways which were coming. She looked at him and thought about Pennsylvania, and the trains, and the agency letter, and the dust storm at the depot, and 2 heavy iron-bound trunks she had carried herself because she had never once waited for someone else to decide what she could carry. She had crossed a continent to arrive here, at this porch, at this man. She had known it for a while. She was allowing herself to know that she'd known it. "Come inside," she said. They went in. The kitchen was still warm from the evening's fire. She built it back up because her hands needed something to do for a moment. And he stood near the table and watched her without speaking. And the lamp was low, and the room was small and warm, and smelled of wood smoke, and the sourdough starter, sitting in its crock on the far shelf, alive and patient. She turned from the stove. He was looking at her across the kitchen with the face he'd had on the porch, open and unguarded, and very tired and entirely present, and she crossed the room and took his face in both hands and kissed him. It was not tentative. She was not a tentative woman, and she had not come this far to be tentative about the things she wanted. He kissed her back, thoroughly, with the particular attention of a man who has been holding himself back from something for a long time, and has stopped. What followed was quiet and real, and nothing like the performances of passion she'd read in the penny novels that circulated through the coal camps. There was no performance in this room. There was just 2 people in a warm kitchen after a hard night, honest with each other in the way that people become honest when they've been through enough together that pretense becomes more effort than it's worth. They were both marked by their lives. That was simply true. She knew his scars by location now, had cleaned 2 of them with carbolic and dressed them with linen. And he knew hers too, had looked at the burn on her forearm more than once without looking away. There was no part of either of them that hadn't been shaped by what they'd survived. And in this room at this hour, those shapes fit together in a way that made a kind of sense she hadn't expected to find. She slept later, on her side, with the warmth of him at her back, and the house settled around them in the dark. In the morning, she woke before him, which was usual. She lay still for a minute, looking at the ceiling, listening to the ordinary sounds of the early morning, the horses shifting in the barn, a bird starting its business somewhere in the brush beyond the fence, the low movement of air that comes before the sun is fully up. She thought about the burned-out building. She thought about the 7 families. She thought about drainage and groundwater, and the coal basin methods she'd learned at Ava's side in the Schuylkill camps, watching the Hungarian woman manage water movement through landscape that was not supposed to allow it. Sterling had burned the feedstock to exhaust them financially. He'd manufactured the warrant to isolate Jed and compromise her credibility. He'd harassed the fence line to keep the ranch in a constant defensive posture. Every move was designed to make holding on cost more than it was worth. The answer to that, she thought, was to change what holding on looked like. Stop defending a single point. Build something that couldn't be taken at one point because it existed at multiple points simultaneously. The water was the center. The spring fed everything. 7 families all downstream from the same source. If she could connect them, not just in spirit, but practically, structurally, through infrastructure and shared stake, Sterling couldn't remove the water by removing one man from one ranch. He'd have to remove a community, and communities fought back differently than individuals. She got up carefully and dressed, and went to the kitchen and started the stove. By the time Jed came down, she had coffee ready, and the ledger open to a clean page, and was making notes. He came in and looked at the coffee and the open ledger and her handwriting filling the page. "How long have you been up?" he said. "An hour." She looked up. "Sit down. I want to show you something." He sat. She turned the ledger so he could see it. The page had a rough diagram, the mesa, the spring, the flow lines to the downstream parcels. 7 marks for 7 families. And then lines she'd added, branching down from the spring in a different direction, with notations in her small, precise hand. "Underground sluice," she said. "Not a surface channel he can dam or divert. Below ground, using the natural slope of the basin. I've seen it done in the Pennsylvania coal country to manage drainage where the surface was too unstable for open channels. The principle applies here." She put her finger on the diagram. "The homesteader's parcels are all within the gradient range. It's engineered rather than natural, but it would work, and once it's built, it requires very little maintenance." Jed was looking at the diagram. "If Sterling diverts the surface runoff," she continued, "the underground system still feeds them," he said. "Yes, and it would need to be built cooperatively, which means every family has stake in it. Damage it, and you damage 7 families' water simultaneously. Sterling doesn't want that fight." Jed looked at her across the table. "You've been thinking about this since last night," he said. "I've been thinking about it since the saloon," she said. "Last night just made the timeline clearer." He looked at the diagram again. He turned the ledger slightly to follow a flow line with his finger. She watched him track it, watched him run the terrain in his mind the way a rancher reads a map not as lines on paper, but as actual ground he knows with his feet. "The east draw," he said. "There's a natural depression that runs the right direction. I always thought it was just drainage. It is drainage. We'd follow the existing grade and formalize it below grade. Less digging than you'd think if you start in the right place." She paused. "I'll need to look at it in daylight, and I'll need to talk to the families. Martha first," he said. "She'll know who else will listen." "That's what I thought, too." He sat back in his chair and looked at her, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window and falling across the ledger and the coffee and her hands. "Last night," he said. She met his eyes. "I meant what I said," he said quietly, "about not being able to keep you safe. I know you did. That hasn't changed. I know that, too." She looked at him steadily. "Jed, I am not asking you to keep me safe. I am asking you to let me help keep us both alive, which is a different conversation." He was quiet. "Those are different things," she said. "One of them is possible." He held her gaze. He was doing the thing he did when he was deciding something, not the quick calculation of a man in a crisis, but the slower, deeper reckoning of a man who knows the decision will hold and wants it to hold right. "The east draw," he said finally. "This week," she said, "while the ground is still soft from the snowmelt." He nodded. She closed the ledger. She got up and turned to the stove to check the bread she'd put in earlier. And he reached out as she passed and caught her hand, just briefly, held it for a second, without saying anything, without looking up from the ledger page. Then let go. She checked the bread. It was done. She took it out and set it on the board, and the smell of it filled the kitchen, warm and reliable and already present, the way the things you tend every day become the texture of a life. Outside, the ruins of the eastern outbuilding were cold in the morning light. The stone foundation stones sat in the ash gray and patient, the way stone sits, indifferent to what has happened above it, waiting for whatever comes next. There would be something next. She would see to it. She had not crossed a continent to stand in the ashes. The east draw was exactly what Birdie had hoped it would be. She walked it twice the morning, after her first look at it once from the spring head down toward the lowest tenant parcel, once back up, kneeling at intervals to press her palm flat against the ground and feel the grade. The slope was consistent, not steep, but enough. Water follows the path of least resistance and doesn't need to be pushed, only directed. And the earth here had been directing it the same way, for long enough that the soil compaction told the story plainly if you knew how to read it. She knew how to read it. Eva had taught her that the ground is always having a conversation about water, and your job is to listen before you start cutting. She made her measurements with a length of knotted cord and a carpenter's level borrowed from Duro's tools, marking intervals with small cairns of stone she built as she went. By midday, she had a clear picture of where the underground sluice needed to run, where it needed to step down to maintain flow, and where the critical junction points were, the places where branch lines could feed out to individual parcels without losing the pressure needed to make them useful. She drew it up that evening at the kitchen table, while Jed watched from across the room, not looking over her shoulder, giving her the working space she needed without being asked. That was something she noticed about him now. He had learned her rhythms the way she had learned his, the sounds that meant she was working and didn't need interruption. The sounds that meant she'd reached the end of a thought and could be talked to. She wasn't sure when they'd started reading each other that accurately. Somewhere in the weeks of shared mornings, probably. The thing about living alongside someone in a working household is that you learn them whether you intend to or not. She finished the drawing and turned it toward him. He studied it. He asked 3 questions, one about the junction point near the Ortega parcel, one about the depth at the rocky section near the Mesa base, one about winter freeze risk in the branch lines. They were good questions. She had answers for 2 of them and an honest uncertainty about the third. She said plainly, "The freeze depth here is shallower than Pennsylvania," she said. "Duro would know better than I do. He's wintered here." Jed called Duro in the next morning. Duro looked at the drawing for a long time, walked his finger along the main line, pointed at 2 spots where he said the ground went to hard clay and would need different digging technique, and said the freeze risk was manageable if they went 18 inches at the shallow end. He spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English, and Birdie followed both without difficulty, which Duro had noticed, and which had changed something in how he spoke to her. More directly, less edited. "It can be done," Duro said, finally, setting the drawing back on the table. "By how many people?" Birdie said. Duro thought about it. "By 3 in about 6 weeks if the ground stays soft. By 10 in 2. Then we need 10, she said. That was when she went to Martha. Martha Keene's parcel was a 40-minute ride south along the base of the mesa. A small adobe house with a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for winter, and a goat pen that needed new posts. Martha was a compact woman in her 50s who had come west with her husband 12 years ago and stayed when he didn't. She ran the parcel herself with Toby's help, and she ran it without complaint, which Birdie had noticed on the supply exchange visits and taken as a measure of her. Birdie rode down alone. Martha opened the door before she knocked, which meant she'd heard the horse, and she looked at Birdie with the alert stillness of someone who has learned to read the purpose of a visit before the words are spoken. "Come in," she said. Toby was at the table with a primer spread open in front of him. He looked up when Birdie came in And his face did what it always did when Birdie appeared, organized itself into a seriousness that was also clearly pleased. The face of a child who has found an adult who treats his attention as worth having. "Good morning, Toby," Birdie said. "Good morning, Miss Birdie." He sat up straighter. She sat across from Martha, with the drawing on the table between them, and explained it plainly. The way she explained everything, starting with the problem, moving to the solution, covering the cost and the labor and the timeline, without softening any of it. She talked about Sterling's water diversion scheme, what she understood of his plans, based on what Jed had told her, and what she'd reasoned out herself. She talked about what it would mean for Martha's parcel if the surface runoff was redirected. Martha listened without interrupting. When Birdie finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the drawing. "The Ortegas," she said, "and the Washburn family on the north edge." "Yes, and the Delgado brothers, and the Yazzie family, and the 2 parcels along the creek bend. 7 altogether, with Black Mesa. 7. Martha looked up. "Do they all know what Sterling's after?" "They know there's trouble," Birdie said. "They may not know the specific shape of it. That's part of why I'm coming to you first. You know these people better than I do. You know who understands the situation and who needs to be shown it." Martha sat back. "Ramon Ortega will understand it immediately. He's been watching the water level in his creek for 2 years, and he knows it's down." She paused. "Old Washburn is stubborn, but he's not foolish. Show him the numbers, and he'll come around. The Yazzie family." She stopped, looked at Birdie. "Some folks in this valley don't trust Black Mesa." Birdie nodded. "Because of Jed. Because Jed has kept to himself for 6 years, and some people read that as looking down on them. It's not right, but it's what's there." "Then I'll go." "Not Jed," Birdie said. Martha looked at her. "You'd go to the Yazzie place alone?" "Why wouldn't I?" Martha considered this. "Most women from back east wouldn't." "I'm not most women from back east," Birdie said. "And I'm not particularly back east anymore." Toby made a sound at the table that was definitely a laugh converted at the last second into a cough. Birdie looked at him. He looked at his primer with great concentration. Martha's mouth curved. "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose you are." They spent another hour at Martha's table going over the plan and the labor requirements and the materials list. Birdie explained the drainage principles, how the underground sluice worked, why depth mattered, how the branch junction points would need to be maintained. She drew it out in simpler form on a separate sheet for Martha to keep. Toby had quietly closed his primer and moved to the edge of the table and was looking at the drawing. "Grade drops here," he said, pointing to the drawing. His finger landed precisely on the step-down point Birdie had marked near the Ortega parcel boundary. "What happens at that drop?" Birdie looked at the spot. "Picks up speed. Too much speed tears out the channel lining. So we put a baffled section here to slow it back down before it enters the branch line." She looked at him directly. "You understand what grade means? In terms of water movement?" Toby sat up straighter. "It's the slope. The steeper it is, the faster the water moves." "Exactly right." She turned the drawing slightly toward him. "And if it moves too fast in an unlined channel, it erodes the sides and the bottom," he said. "Like what happened to our drainage ditch last spring." "Exactly like that," she said. "Which is why we line the critical sections with clay-packed stone before we close them in." Toby looked at the drawing for another moment, working through something. "Can I help dig?" "Toby," Martha said. "I can dig," he said. He said it without defensiveness, which was different from how children usually said the things adults doubted about them. He said it as a plain statement of fact. Birdie looked at him. "I know you can," she said. "But I'll need someone who can keep accurate notes on the water depth measurements as we go. That requires someone who can read a chord measurement and write it down correctly every time, in the right column, without being asked twice." She looked at him steadily. "Is that something you think you can manage?" Toby looked back at her with the same steadiness. "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'll need you at the site on digging days," she said, with a notebook. "Can you make one?" "I have paper." "Good." She stood and began rolling the drawing. Martha, will you go with me to the Ortega place tomorrow? I'll go, Martha said. Over the next 8 days, Birdie visited every parcel in the valley. Martha came to 3 of them. For the others, she went alone, riding out in the cold mornings with the drawing in her saddlebag and the materials list, and the plain, direct language she'd developed over 11 years of explaining complex things to people who had no reason yet to trust her. The Ortegas came aboard immediately, as Martha had predicted. Ramon Ortega was a barrel-chested man in his 40s who listened to the first 2 minutes of Birdie's explanation and then said, in Spanish, that he'd been waiting for someone to propose exactly this for 3 years. And when did they start? His wife, Elena, added that she would cook for the work crew on the days they were on their land, which Birdie noted in the ledger as a significant logistical contribution. The Washburn family was slower. Old Washburn asked the same question 3 different ways before he was satisfied, which Birdie didn't mind, because asking the same question 3 different ways is how a careful man makes certain he's understood. His adult son, Frank, asked a 4th version of the question that was actually a different question, about land liability if the sluice ran across a parcel boundary, and Birdie answered it specifically and correctly, and Frank Washburn nodded and said they were in. The Yazzie family was the conversation she'd been most uncertain about. Nevaeh Yazzie met her at the parcel boundary. She was a woman roughly Birdie's age, tall and direct, with the watchful quality of someone who has had good reasons to be watchful. She looked at Birdie for a long moment before she said anything. "You're the woman from the Burke Ranch," she said. "From Black Mesa, yes. Colter's woman." Birdie didn't correct the characterization. His wife, soon enough. "Yes." Nevaeh looked at her. "He hasn't come here himself, because I asked him not to," Birdie said. "The history between your family and Black Mesa is something I'm aware of, and I thought it would be more useful for you to hear this from me first, without that history in the room." Another long look. "What do you know about that history?" That Jed kept to himself for years, in a way that read as contempt to people who had no reason to assume otherwise, Birdie said, and that a man who is grieving and isolating looks from the outside very much like a man who thinks he's better than his neighbors, and I understand why it was read that way. Nave was quiet. "The water doesn't care about that history," Birdie said, "and neither do your crops." Nave looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she called to her husband, a quiet man named Eli, who came out from behind the house, and listened to Birdie explain the plan a second time. He asked about the clay lining technique. Birdie explained the layering method, the way you packed clay against stone in alternating layers for stability. Eli said, "I know this method. We used something like it for the irrigation channels on my grandfather's land." "Then you'll be able to explain it to the others when we get to your parcel section," Birdie said. "And that would be useful because hearing it from you will matter to people it might not matter hearing from me." Eli looked at her, then at Nevaeh. Something passed between them. "We'll come," Nevaeh said. By the end of the 8 days, all 7 families were committed. The work began on a Monday, cold and clear, with the ground still soft from residual snowmelt. 12 people showed up that first day, more than Birdie had planned for, because several families had brought adult children or older relatives who'd decided independently to come. She reorganized the work assignments on the spot, which meant the day started 30 minutes late, and was still more efficient than she'd projected. Toby was there with his notebook and his pencil, and he measured and noted with the precision she'd asked for, calling out the chord measurements in a clear voice that carried down the line. The digging was hard work. The topsoil gave way easily, but below it the ground was dense and required different tools in different sections. The spade at the surface, the pick bar in the clay sections Duro had identified, careful handwork near the rock outcrops at the mesa base. Birdie worked alongside everyone else. She had learned long ago that a person who gives orders from a dry position while others do the hard labor creates a specific kind of resentment that poisons a project from the inside, and that the opposite, showing up with your sleeves rolled and your back in it, builds something different. Elena Ortega brought food at noon, as she'd promised. She brought it in a wagon with her 2 daughters, and enough food for 20 people, which was generous beyond the numbers, but turned out to be accurate to the appetite. 12 people who have spent a cold morning digging eat more than their resting count suggests. They ate together, all of them, at the long, improvised table of planks across sawhorses that Duro had set up near the worksite. Anglo-Mexican, Comanche, mixed heritage, old-young. Eli Yazzie sat beside Frank Washburn and explained the clay lining technique he'd mentioned to his grandfather's people, and Frank listened and asked practical questions, and by the end of lunch, they'd agreed on a modification to the lining method that would work better in the specific soil conditions of the valley's west sections. Birdie watched this from the far end of the table. She watched Toby show his measurement notebook to Ramon Ortega's youngest son, who was 12 and had been watching Toby work all morning with undisguised interest. She watched Toby explain the columns, what went in each one, why the measurements needed to be taken at the same points each time to be comparable with the seriousness of a child who has been given a real job and knows the difference. She had started reading with Toby during the supply exchange visits, the 2 of them at the kitchen table with the ledger books, and then expanded it into basic arithmetic and then into the practical applications of arithmetic that made immediate sense to him: measurement, proportion, the relationship between numbers and real things in the world. He learned the way some children learn, fast, hungry, needing only to be shown once. He had been managing without formal schooling for years, learning what life gave him, and what life had given him was useful and real, but had gaps that showed when you offered something more structured. She was filling those gaps. He was running to meet her. On the 3rd day of work, she was at the junction point near the Ortega boundary when she heard Jed's voice behind her, talking to Ramon. She straightened and turned. He'd come down to help with the heavy timber work at the junction housing, which required someone with both the engineering sense and the physical strength to set the baffled section correctly. He was in his work clothes, talking to Ramon with a directness and a lack of ceremony that surprised her. She hadn't been sure how he'd be with the families, given the history Martha had described. Ramon was talking back with the same directness. She realized, watching them, that the problem had not been Jed's manner. Exactly. His manner was always direct. The problem had been absence, 6 years of absence that had meant the directness never happened, and people had filled the space with their own interpretations. With him here, working alongside them, the interpretations had somewhere to correct against. He looked over at her once, across the worksite, and she held his gaze for a moment. He went back to the timber. At the end of the 4th day, they were halfway through the main line. Navai Yazzie walked up beside Birdie as she was packing her tools and stood there looking at the progress. "You said soon enough," Navai said. "About being his wife." "Yes," Birdie said. "Out here we do that at the land office mostly. Or we don't, and it amounts to the same thing after enough time." "I know." Birdie wrapped her cord and put it in her bag. "We'll do it properly. When this is finished and the situation is more settled." Navai was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother would say that waiting for settled is how people spend their whole lives waiting." Birdie looked at her. Navai's mouth curved. "I'm just passing it along," she said, and walked to where Eli was loading their tools. The work continued. 12 days in, and the main line was complete, packed, and closed, and marked with flush-set stones that would be invisible from above, but findable by anyone who knew where to look. The branch lines took another week, each one a negotiation with local terrain. Eli Yazzie and Frank Washburn became the chief engineers of the branching sections, which Birdie hadn't planned for and wouldn't have been able to plan for, and which turned out to be better for the work than having everything run through her. That was what happened when you built something cooperatively rather than just directing it. People found the parts that fit them and filled those parts in ways you couldn't have assigned. On the final day, when the last branch section was closed and Toby had written the final measurements in his notebook, in his careful columns, they stood around the unassuming line of flush-set stones and looked at what they'd built. You couldn't see it. That was the point. From above, it was just ground. Underneath it was a working system of connected channels that would feed 7 parcels from deep groundwater sources that Sterling could not dam, could not divert, could not reach with legal machinery or hired men or arson. Jed stood beside Birdie. "If he diverts the surface runoff now," Duro said from nearby. "We're still fed," Ramon said. "All 7 of us," Frank Washburn said. Eli Yazzie looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up at Jed. "My family has been on this valley for a long time," he said. "We've watched people come and try to take pieces of it, one at a time. Sterling is not new. His kind is not new." He paused. "What's new is this." He gestured at the line of stones and the people standing around it. Jed nodded. He didn't add to it. He didn't need to. Birdie looked at the flush stones and thought about the coal camp mess halls and the long tables, and Eva's voice saying, "You cannot starve 7 men at once." 7 families was not 7 men. 7 families was a valley. Sterling could still come. He would come. She had no illusions about that. But the shape of what he'd find when he came was different now, and she had built part of that difference with her hands and her knowledge, and the plain willingness to show up in the morning and work alongside people until they trusted the work enough to make it their own. She picked up her bag. "Dinner at Black Mesa," she said to the group. "Anyone who wants to come." 9 people came. She fed all of them from the large cookpots she'd been scaling her recipes toward for weeks, and Toby sat at the main table and showed his measurement notebook to anyone who'd look, and the kitchen was loud in a way it had never been in all the months she'd been there. Jed sat at the head of the table and was quiet and present, and she watched him across the room and thought about what Neve had said about waiting. After everyone had gone and the kitchen was clean, she told him. He stood at the window looking at the dark yard, and she told him what Neve had said, plain and without preface. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned from the window. "She's right," he said. Birdie looked at him. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. "I'm not waiting for Settled," he said. "Settled isn't coming before Sterling, and Settled isn't coming after Sterling either. There is no Settled out here. There's just the people you chose and the work you do." She looked up at him. "Marry me," he said. "Properly." Soon, she looked at him for a long moment, at the face she'd read correctly from early on, underneath all the defenses, at the man who'd ridden all night to the territorial capital with her bond money and his land as collateral. "Yes," she said. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet, and under the ground the new channels waited for spring, patient and invisible, and already belonging to everyone. The warning came from Toby. He'd been up before dawn, checking the water measurements at the junction point near the Ortega boundary, which had become his regular morning task in the weeks since the sluice was completed. He took the measurements seriously, recording them in his notebook with the same careful columns he'd maintained during construction. And he'd developed the habit of walking the full line on clear mornings before school. He was on the east edge of the ranch property when he saw the riders. He counted 7. They were coming from the direction of the canyon road, moving in a column. And the light was still low enough that he couldn't make out faces, but he could see the silhouettes, and he could see that 2 of them were carrying something long and cylindrical across their saddles. He lay flat in the brush and watched them pass below him on the road, heading north, toward the reservoir. He got up and ran. He came through the Black Mesa gate at a dead run, which was faster than it looked because the boy had learned to move efficiently over uneven ground. In the years, his leg had made him figure out alternatives to the way other people moved. He was shouting before he reached the porch. Birdie heard him first. She was already in the kitchen, and she was out the door in seconds. And she heard what he was saying before he finished saying it and turned back inside. "Jed," she called up the stairs. He was down in less than a minute, boots on, reading her face. "7 riders," she said. "Canyon Road, heading north." Toby saw 2 of them carrying what sounds like blasting equipment. Jed's face went still in the way it did when something was serious, and he was moving past reaction into action. "The dam," he said. "Yes." He went for his rifle. She went for the shotgun. Toby was on the porch, breathing hard, and she stopped in the doorway. "Toby, go to Martha's. Stay there until I come for you myself. Do you understand? Don't come to the reservoir. Don't follow us." Toby looked at her. He was frightened and trying not to show it, which she noted and respected. "Yes, ma'am. Go now." He went. She and Jed rode hard. The reservoir was 40 minutes at a working pace. They covered it in 25, pushing the horses on the straight sections and controlling them on the rocky approaches to the canyon. The sun was just clearing the mesa's east face, throwing long red light across the valley floor. And Birdie rode with the shotgun across her saddle and her eyes on the canyon rim. She heard the riders before they came in sight, horses on stone, the sound carrying clearly in the cold morning air. Then she heard voices, and then the canyon opened up, and she saw them. 7 men, as Toby had counted. They were arranged along the north face of the earthen dam, the ridge that Jed and Duro had built and reinforced over 3 seasons to hold the reservoir that fed the spring. 3 of the men were on foot at the base of the dam, working. 2 of them had the long cylinders she'd been afraid of, blasting tubes, packed with black powder, the kind used for mining work. The other 2 were mounted on the ridge above, watching the approaches. Vogel was one of the mounted men. He saw them at the same moment they saw him. "Colter," he said. His voice carried down the canyon wall without effort. The pale eyes moved from Jed to Birdie and back. "You're too late. Charges are set." Jed pulled up. Birdie pulled up beside him. She looked at the dam. The men at the base had stopped working, but 2 of them still had their hands near the blasting equipment, and the leads were already run. The fuses, she could see even at this distance, were short. Short fuses meant they'd planned to be moving when the charge went, which meant they hadn't expected company this early. Toby had changed their arithmetic. "Walk away from the dam," Jed said. His voice was level. "Sterling owns the upstream water rights. As of yesterday morning," Vogel said. "Territorial Court, Santa Fe, signed and filed." He reached into his coat and produced a document, held it up briefly. "This reservoir sits on Sterling's water claim. We're exercising the right to modify the infrastructure." "With a blasting charge," Birdie said. Vogel looked at her. "With whatever tools the job requires." She was calculating. 7 men, 2 mounted on the ridge, 3 at the dam base with the blasting equipment, 2 more on the flat behind Vogel. Jed's rifle and her shotgun against 7 armed men in a canyon where the walls gave the high positions a significant advantage. Direct confrontation wasn't survivable, but the dam was. She looked at the dam itself. It was an earthen structure, broad at the base, with timber-braced retention walls at the north and south ends, built over 3 seasons, reinforced, solid. She'd helped Duro repack the south berm after the blizzard had shifted some of the upper material. She knew it. She also knew the release gates. They were at the south end, 2 heavy timber gates set into the base of the dam that could be opened to draw down the reservoir level in a controlled way. Used carefully, they could reduce the reservoir to a level where a blasting charge would have nothing to contain no water pressure, to amplify the force and send the contents down the valley in a destructive wave. If the charge went with the reservoir full, it wasn't just the dam that was lost. The force of the water would take everything downstream. Martha's parcel, the Ortega field, the lower sections of 5 of the 7 families' land, flooded and scoured by a surge nobody was prepared for. If the reservoir was drawn down first, a blasting charge would damage the dam structure, but not create that wave. She looked at Jed. He was watching Vogel. His hand was on his rifle. She could see the calculation he was doing. Jed, she said quietly. The south gates. He heard her. She saw it in the slight shift of his posture. Keep him talking, he said, low enough for only her. She stepped her horse forward 2 paces, which drew Vogel's attention. The territorial court ruling, she said, loudly enough to project up the canyon wall. What's the date of filing? Vogel looked at her with his pale eyes. Yesterday. I told you. The filing date on the original water claim, she said. Sterling's claim predates Jed's registered deed by how long? A pause. Vogel hadn't expected a legal conversation. That's a matter for the court, he said. It's a matter I'm asking you about directly, she said, because a claim filed after a registered deed doesn't supersede it, regardless of what a territorial judge signs. That's federal land statute, not territorial discretion. And if Sterling's lawyers filed against a prior registered deed, the Santa Fe ruling is challengeable on its face. She was keeping his attention on her voice, on the legal argument she was constructing in real time. It wasn't strategy exactly. It was what she did. She talked about real things that needed to be addressed, and she talked about them with enough specificity that people had to engage with the substance even when they didn't want to. In her peripheral vision, she saw Jed moving his horse south along the dam base. Slowly, at the pace of a man not going anywhere in particular, Vogel tracked him. Colter, stay where you are. I'm listening to my wife, Jed said. The 2 men behind Vogel moved to intercept. Jed pulled up. Birdie pushed forward again, drawing eyes back to her. The witnesses on the original Sterling claim, she said, are they the same witnesses who signed the vouchers for the fraud warrant last month? Because documented perjury on one instrument calls into question every instrument those witnesses appear on. One of the men at the dam base had turned to watch her. Enough, Vogel said. Are they or aren't they? She said. Light it, Vogel said. One of the men at the base reached for a match. What happened next? Happened fast. Jed drove his horse directly into the 2 men who'd moved to block him, not gently, and the horses collided with a sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Both men went sideways on their mounts, and one of them lost the stirrup entirely and grabbed for his saddle horn. Jed was past them before they recovered. Birdie swung the shotgun up and fired the first barrel into the air directly above the man with the match. The sound in the canyon was enormous. The horses at the dam base all shied simultaneously, hard, and the man with the match went down under his horse's movement, and the match went with him into the dirt. Jed reached the south end of the dam. He was off his horse, and at the release gate mechanism in 4 seconds. The gates were heavy timber with iron fittings, held by drop bolts. He pulled the first bolt and shoved the gate. Water came through. It came through controlled and deliberate. Not a flood, just a strong, steady draw that began pulling the reservoir level down toward the south drainage channel, away from the dam face. The sound of it changed the character of the canyon, a constant, deep rush beneath everything else. Vogel was shouting. The man who'd gone down near the dam base was back up. He had the match. He looked from the match to the dam to Vogel, and his face showed the problem he was now facing. The blasting charge was set for a full reservoir. Drawing down the reservoir didn't just reduce the effect. At a certain lower level, the charge would crack the dam structure without producing the catastrophic wave. Sterling needed to make the destruction useful. A cracked dam could be repaired. A destroyed dam downstream was the point. He looked at Vogel. Vogel's face had changed. Birdie drove her horse between the man with the match and the lead that ran to the charge. She positioned the horse broadside, the largest possible obstacle, and held the reins steady. And the horse was a good horse and held the position without panic because she was calm and a horse takes its cues. The second barrel was still loaded. Move back from the lead, she said. The man looked at the shotgun. I've had 1 shot to demonstrate accuracy today, she said. I'd rather not need a second, but I've got one available. He stepped back. Vogel spun his horse on the ridge. He was calculating. She could see it from 30 feet below, the rapid assessment of a man whose plan has been disrupted at the critical moment and who is weighing the cost of forcing it forward versus the cost of stopping. The reservoir was audibly lower. The draw from the south gate was strong and steady. Jed had gotten the second gate open, too. Vogel made his calculation. "Pull back," he said to his men. His voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a man containing something large. "Pull back." The men at the dam base moved, slowly, with the resentful reluctance of armed men who are not accustomed to stopping, but they moved. The two on the canyon rim moved their horses back toward the canyon road. The men behind Birdie pulled clear. Vogel was last. He looked at Jed, who had come back to his horse and was standing beside it at the south end of the dam, watching. Then he looked at Birdie. "This isn't resolution," he said. "No," she agreed. "But neither is today." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode for the canyon road, and his men fell in behind him. She let out a breath. Jed was already at the charge, pulling the leads out of the powder-packed tubes carefully. Methodically, the way you handle something dangerous when the danger is no longer immediate and you have the time to be careful. She watched him clear the leads and pull the tubes out of the packed earth and set them aside. Her arms were shaking slightly. She noticed this the way she noticed things that didn't need immediate attention noted and filed for later when there was time. She closed the second gate. He closed the first. The draw slowed and stopped, and the reservoir settled at its reduced level, lower but intact, the dam structure unharmed. They stood at the south end and looked at what it held. "The dam is fine," she said. "Yes." "The water claim filing." She looked at him. "Is it real? Can Sterling file after your registered deed?" "He can file," Jed said. "Whether it holds is a different question. Our territorial land office contact thinks it's challengeable. We'd need a federal advocate, not a territorial one. Then we need to find one." "Yes." She looked at the reservoir, the surface still and cold in the morning light, reflecting the canyon walls in long red-brown lines. Then she heard horses. She turned. Coming from the south approach, not the canyon road, multiple horses, moving at a controlled pace. Sheriff Miller, on his gray, and beside him, a man she didn't recognize, wearing a coat that read as official even at a distance. They pulled up at the dam. Miller looked at the pulled blasting tubes on the ground. He looked at Jed. He looked at Birdie. He had the expression of a man who has arrived slightly too late and is assessing what he missed. "Vogel was here," Miller said. "He was," Birdie said. "We had a report from—" Miller paused. "From a young man. Said there were 7 riders heading to the reservoir with blasting equipment. Toby. He hadn't just gone to Martha's. He'd gone to Martha's and then run to the sheriff's office, which was 2 miles in the wrong direction for a boy with a bad leg and was not nothing." The man beside Miller reached into his coat. "Deputy Marshal Clarence Holt, out of Albuquerque. I've been investigating Sterling Land Holdings' territorial filing practices for 3 months. He looked at the blasting tubes on the ground. "I'll need those as evidence." Miller looked at Jed for a long moment. Something in his tired face shifted the particular shift of a man who has been making small gestures for a long time and has finally been given the opportunity to make a real one. "We'll need statements from both of you," Miller said. "Full accounts of what happened here this morning and what's happened prior." "We'll give them," Birdie said. Miller looked at her. "Miss Burke," he stopped. "Mrs. Colter." She hadn't corrected Neve when she'd said it, and she didn't correct Miller now. "Sheriff, I owe you an apology," he said. "For the jail, for the proceedings." She looked at him steadily. "You were working inside a situation that had been closing around you for a long time," she said. "I understand how that happens. What matters now is what you do with the room you have." He held her gaze. Then he nodded once and dismounted to secure the blasting tubes. Jed came to stand beside her. She was looking south, down the valley, where the drainage channel ran clean and cold in the morning light, toward the invisible underground sluice and the 7 parcels it fed. She heard him before he spoke. That particular quality of attention she'd learned to read. "Vogel," he said quietly. He was looking north, toward the canyon road where the riders had disappeared. His jaw was set. She looked at him. His rifle was still in his hand. "Let it go for now," she said. He looked at her. "Miller has him on attempted destruction of water infrastructure," she said. "Holt has him in a federal investigation. The charge leads are evidence. 7 families can testify to the water claim history." She held his gaze. "We have more on Vogel right now than we could get with a rifle. And the rifle only costs us." He stood with the rifle in his hand, and she could see the pull in him, the 6 years of carrying something that wanted resolution, the image of what Vogel's kind of men had done to Catalina, the accumulated weight of everything that had been taken. She put her hand over the barrel, not pushing it down, just her hand on it, steady and present. "Do not surrender your humanity to a dead man's malice," she said quietly. "Let justice hold the ledger." He looked at her hand on the barrel. The canyon was quiet, except for the sound of Miller and Holt working at the dam base and the water in the drainage channel running south. Slowly, Jed lowered the rifle. She kept her hand on his arm for a moment. Then he stepped forward to talk to Holt, and she turned to help Miller secure the scene. And the morning light came fully over the mesa and lit the canyon and the valley below it in the long, clear gold of a winter day that had decided to be beautiful regardless of what had happened at its beginning. Spring came to the valley the way it always does in New Mexico. Not gently, not as an arrival, but as a decision the land makes without consulting anyone. One morning the light is different, and the ground has changed, and the creek is running higher and louder, and something in everything alive has understood that the calculation has shifted. Black Mesa Ranch understood it too. The south-facing slope below the eastern pasture was showing green in the grass already, and the winter-bare cottonwoods along the creek bend had gone a particular pale gold green at the tips that meant they'd started. The herd was restless in the good way, moving for the pleasure of it in the mornings rather than the necessity. Even the mesa itself looked different in spring light, the same stone, but warmer, as if the red in it had deepened during the winter and was only now letting itself be seen. The reservoir was full. Sterling's territorial filing had been formally challenged within 2 weeks of the dam standoff. Deputy Marshal Holt's investigation had produced enough documentation to bring federal charges against Sterling for systematic fraud in territorial water rights filings. Black Mesa was one of 4 separate cases. The charges had moved fast, as federal charges sometimes do when the documentation is solid, and the U.S. Marshals are already involved, and by February Sterling had retained 2 lawyers and withdrawn to his main property in Santa Fe, and had not been seen in the valley since. Vogel had been arrested the morning after the standoff. Miller had served the warrant himself, with Holt present, and Birdie had heard later from Duro that Miller had served it with a directness and completeness that had surprised people who'd spent years watching him make small gestures. The trial was scheduled for July in Albuquerque. The blasting tubes and the charge leads, and Toby's notebook with the morning measurements, and 7 signed affidavits from the Valley families had all gone to the Federal Evidence Office. Toby had signed his affidavit in Miller's office, sitting straight in the chair, and written his name in the clear, careful hand he'd been developing since Birdie started teaching him. Miller had looked at the signature and then at the boy, and not said anything, which sometimes is the most respectful response. The land office had confirmed Jed's prior registered deed as superseding Sterling's filing. A federal advocate out of Albuquerque, a woman named Rosario Vega, who had been handling territorial land cases for 12 years, had taken the Black Mesa case and 3 others and moved through the legal machinery with the particular efficiency of someone who knows exactly where the leverage points are and applies pressure to them without wasted motion. Birdie liked her immediately. The bond had been released in March. The land was free. On the morning of the wedding, Birdie woke before anyone else, which was usual, and lay still for a minute, listening to the ranch. She could hear the horses. She could hear the creek, higher than it had been a month ago. She could hear a mockingbird somewhere on the east fence, going through its entire repertoire in the pre-dawn quiet, trying everything it knew. She got up and dressed and went to the kitchen and started the stove. She wasn't anxious. She'd been asked about that by Martha, who'd come over the day before to help with the preparations and had looked at Birdie with that particular watchful attention and said, "How are you?" genuinely, and Birdie had considered the question seriously, the way it deserved, and said she was settled, and meant it. She was not someone who had spent her life dreaming of a wedding. She'd spent her life working toward a particular kind of standing, the standing of a person who is useful and capable and treated accordingly, and this was an extension of that, not a departure from it. The man she was marrying understood that. He'd understood it from before he could have articulated it, she thought, which was why they'd worked together from almost the beginning, even when they were still working out whether they could trust each other. She made bread, the sourdough, the active culture that had traveled from Pennsylvania in her coat pocket and had been feeding the household for months. She shaped it and set it to prove and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light come over the mesa. The valley was visible from this window on clear mornings, the lower parcels south and west in the early light. She could see, or could imagine she could see, the flush-set stones of the underground sluice line running beneath the ground toward the 7 families, whose spring crops were already showing green. She couldn't actually see them, but she knew they were there. By 9 o'clock, the yard was filling up. The Ortegas came first, Elena's wagon loaded with food, and her 2 daughters in their best clothes. Ramon lifted his hat to Birdie when he came through the gate and said something in Spanish that made Elena look pleased, and Birdie's Spanish was good enough to catch the meaning, which was that the place looked like it had decided to be worth looking at. The Washburn family came next, Frank and his father and Frank's wife and their 3 children, the youngest of whom was carried on Frank's shoulders. Old Washburn shook Jed's hand with both of his own and said nothing, which from Washburn was considerable. Nave and Eliyazi arrived with Nave's mother, who was a very small elderly woman, who moved slowly and observed everything with the sharp attention of someone who has been watching people for a long time and has formed clear opinions. She looked at Birdie for a long moment when they were introduced, and then patted her hand once, firmly, and said something to Nave. Nave translated. She says you have good feet. Birdie looked at her feet, and then at Nave. It means you're grounded, Nave said. It's a compliment. The Delgado brothers came with their families, and the families from the Creek Bend parcels. And Duro, who had put on a clean shirt and had his hair combed, and stood at the edge of the gathering, looking uncomfortable in the good way of a man at a celebration. Martha came last with Toby. Toby was in a shirt that was ironed and slightly too large for him, and he was carrying something wrapped in cloth under his arm. He came directly to Birdie when he arrived and held it out. "I made this," he said. She unwrapped it. It was a wooden box, simple, made from pine boards, with a latch carved from the same wood. On the lid he had burned letters with a hot iron, careful and deliberate. B. Colter accounts. She looked at it. He was watching her with that seriousness he carried everywhere, slightly anxious now, the way children are when they're waiting to see if what they've made is adequate. "Toby," she said. "I practiced the letters for 2 weeks," he said. She put her hand on his shoulder, which for her was the equivalent of what other people might do with considerably more ceremony. "It's exactly right," she said. "It'll be on my desk for the rest of my working life." His face resolved into relief, and then into the pleased, contained expression of someone who has done a thing well, and knows it, and is not going to make too much of that. Martha looked at Birdie from behind him, and her eyes were bright. The ceremony itself was simple. A justice of the peace from Oakhaven named Caldwell, a dry-spoken man in his 60s, who read the standard language with the practical efficiency of someone who considers the legal record, the main business, and the surrounding emotion, the participants' private affair. Jed and Birdie stood on the porch in front of the open door, and the valley people gathered in the yard, below the steps in the spring light. When Caldwell asked if anyone had objection, old Washburn said loudly, from the back, "If anyone here has an objection, they'd best keep it to themselves." And there was laughter, and even Caldwell's mouth moved. They said the words. Birdie said them, looking at Jed's face, which was the way she paid attention to things that mattered directly, without deflection. He looked back at her the same way, and the words were ordinary words, the same words said in every corner of the country every day, and somehow that made them more rather than less, because the ordinary things are the ones you live in. After, there was food. Elena and her daughters had been setting up since before the ceremony, and what appeared on the long tables in the yard was enough for twice the number present, chile verde and tortillas, and 3 kinds of beans and Birdie's bread, and a cake that Elena had somehow produced, and that was covered in dried fruit, soaked in something that Birdie suspected was fortified wine. People ate and talked, and the children ran in the yard, and 2 of the Delgado brothers produced a guitar between them and played for a while near the barn, and the afternoon was warm enough that coats came off. Jed had disappeared inside after the meal, and Birdie was talking with Rosario Vega, who had come from Albuquerque specifically, and who had opinions about the ongoing federal water case that Birdie wanted to hear in detail. They were in the middle of a specific point about prior filing dates when Jed appeared at the porch door. "Birdie." She looked up. "Come inside." She excused herself and went up the porch steps. He led her to the main room. In the center of the room, where the light from both windows fell on it, was a chair. It was oak, heavy, solid oak, with wide, flat arms and a deep seat and a back that curved in the particular way a good chair curves, following the body rather than forcing the body to follow it. It was large, substantially larger than an ordinary chair, built with the proportions of someone who had measured the person it was made for, and built to those measurements without apology or diminishment. He had carved the joints himself, she could tell by the tool marks, and the seat had been sanded to a surface that was smooth under her palm when she touched it, and it rocked. She pushed it gently, and it moved in a long, easy arc, the rockers hitting the floor in that rhythm that is immediately and always reassuring. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I started it in February," he said. When the land cleared, he was looking at the chair rather than at her. The way he looked at things when he was talking about something important and needed a direction for his attention. "The proportions are yours. I measured while you were working, which you didn't notice, because you were looking at the ledgers. You measured me while I was working," she said. "Your shoulder width, for the back, and the seat depth. A chair built for someone else's proportions wears on you over time. I didn't want that." She looked at the chair. She thought about Pennsylvania, about the camp offices and the supply rooms and the mine superintendent, and every room in her life where she had been told, in explicit terms or in architecture, that she was too much, too large, that the space wasn't built for her, and she should adjust herself accordingly. She thought about Jed measuring her shoulder width while she read ledgers, building to her dimensions, without her having to ask. She sat down in the chair. It fit. That was the simple fact of it. It fit in the way that almost nothing had ever fit, the way a thing fits when it was made for the actual person sitting in it, and not for an idea of what a person should be. She rocked once. The chair moved in its long, easy arc and settled back. Jed was watching her now, not the chair. His face had the open quality it had taken on since the dam, since the legal machinery had started running correctly, since the valley had built its alliance and held it a face with more room in it than it used to have. "It's the best thing anyone has ever made me," she said. He sat on the arm of the nearby bench. He looked at her, in the chair. "When the child is old enough to sit with you," he said quietly, "the chair will hold you both." She looked at him. She hadn't told him yet, or thought she hadn't, and the fact that he knew meant he'd read it the way he read things he paid attention to through small observable facts rather than declarations. "You know," she said. "I think so," he said. "Is it right?" "It's right," she said. He was quiet. The room was warm with the afternoon light, and the sounds of the yard came in through the open window voices. Laughter, the guitar, the smell of the food and the spring air and the ranch. He put his hand on the arm of the chair, near hers. Not a gesture, just his hand there. She put hers over it. Outside, the Valley families were in the yard of Black Mesa Ranch in the spring light, eating Elena's food and listening to the Delgado brothers and letting the afternoon do what afternoons at celebrations do. Martha was watching Toby explain his measurement notebook to one of the Ortega boys. Neve's grandmother was sitting in a chair someone had brought her, watching everything with her sharp old eyes and having opinions. Duro had found someone to talk to, apparently, because he was no longer standing alone at the edge of things, but was in a conversation with Frank Washburn near the water trough, and both of them were looking at the fence line on the east side and gesturing in the way of men discussing what needs to be done to a thing. The mockingbird was still on the east fence, or a different mockingbird, it was impossible to tell. It went through everything it knew. It had a lot to say. Birdie rocked the chair once. The solid weight of it moved and settled. The oak warm under her palms, built to her size and no apology for it. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. It had arrived the previous week from her cousin Margaret in Schuylkill County, the first contact from the Eastern family in 2 years. She'd read it once. It was full of the things she'd expected. Careful phrasing around the mine superintendent incident, something that wanted to be an explanation and stopped short of being an apology, an invitation to return to Pennsylvania as if the last 3 years hadn't happened, and the West was a weather event she had survived and could now put behind her. At some point before the guests left this evening, she would put it in the hearth, not with anger. She had examined herself on this carefully, and what she found when she looked for anger was mostly just the absence of it, the quiet of a settled account. The letter was from people who had been unable to see her clearly, and she no longer needed them to. She had built something on this ground that had no precedent in their understanding of what she was, and explaining it to them was not the use she intended to make of her time. She would put it in the fire and watch it go, and feel nothing she needed to hold on to. Jed stood from the bench. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just once, passing and went to the door to go back to the guests. He stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Come out when you're ready," he said. "Elena made something with the dried fruit, and I think there's spirits involved, and you should witness it." She looked at him in the doorway, at the man she'd arrived to find standing at a depot hitching post, hostile and closed, managing a ranch and a grief and a water dispute and a wall built of 3 years of flinching away from anyone who came close. He was standing in his own doorway in spring light, with an open face. "Give me a minute," she said. He went. She sat in the chair he'd made her. The afternoon light moved through the window across the floor, and she could hear the valley outside, her people in the yard, and under the ground, between here and the horizon, the sluice ran quiet and invisible, feeding everything downstream. She had come west fleeing one kind of life, and had built, in its place, something she had not known to plan for not safety, not ease, but something truer than either. A life measured in actual things, ground worked and water secured, and a community built across difference. A boy learning to keep accounts. A man learning to keep a door open. A chair made to the right dimensions in a room that fit. She sat in the chair for another minute. Then she got up and went outside to her people, into the spring afternoon, into the sound of the guitar and the laughter and the ordinary, enormous life she had chosen and crossed a continent to find. The mesa stood behind the ranch, unchanged and permanent and entirely indifferent, the way it had been before any of them, and would be long after. Today it looked, in the spring light, almost like it approved. This is a work of pure fiction. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, for entertainment purposes only.